Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere grim. Really grim. You're going to wake up in a world that's just crawled out of the worst pandemic it has ever known, the Black Death. Not a cool name for a pet snake, unfortunately. This is about the actual plague that wiped out around 1/3 to half of Europe's population in just a few years starting in 1347. And you're still standing. Which is kind of a miracle. You survived, but let's be honest, you probably won't survive this story. Not emotionally, anyway. What you're walking into is a landscape of haunting silence, strange hope, and social upheaval so huge that even the cows are confused. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from and how close it is to midnight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's late summer, and you're trudging down a dirt road that cuts through what used to be a bustling village. Used to be. Half the houses are abandoned. The other half, shuttered, creaking in the breeze with doors left swinging on broken hinges. The air smells of dust and old wood, with a hint of decay. Not fresh decay. This is the scent of long-ago deaths that still haven't been scrubbed from the walls. There's no sound except for the wind, your footsteps, and a raven that won't stop following you. You try not to make eye contact with it. Superstitions are loud in your head right now. The plague swept through this place like a ghost with no manners. It took the baker, the smith, the priest, the weaver, and 3/4 of the town's children. The well is dry. The market stalls are covered in mildew, and the church bells haven't rung in months. What's eerie isn't just the death, it's the pause. Like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. You pass a toppled cart with shriveled apples rotting where they fell. No one bothered to pick them up. Time has lost its urgency here. You reach the centre of town. Once a hub of laughter, gossip and barter, now it's just empty. But there are signs of life. A single candle flickers in a second-story window. A pair of muddy boots sits by a door, still wet from this morning's rain. Someone else is alive in this ghost town. You're not alone, but it sure feels like it. The weirdest part? You should be dead. Statistically speaking, you shouldn't be here. But here you are, heart beating, lungs full of damp village air, trying to figure out what life looks like after the end of the world. And that's the thing. This isn't the end. It just really feels like it. So now what? You sit on a crooked bench by the well and look around. There's a strangeness to survival, like waking up late to a party where half the guests are gone and the ones left are too traumatized to dance. Everyone's grieving someone, some are grieving everyone, and grief is sticky. It changes how people look at each other. Before the plague, you might have been a nobody, just another peasant trying to avoid taxes and bad soup. Now, your face matters, because there aren't many left. And yet, here's the bizarre part. Beneath all the sorrow and ash, something else is starting to twitch. Possibility. You feel it in the quiet, in the newness of things that haven't been rebuilt yet. People are rethinking everything, from how they farm to who they marry to why they even go to church. The old order didn't save them. Priests died like everyone else. The nobles hid in their manors and still lost half their heirs. The doctors bled people and wrapped them in herbs and plague masks shaped like birds. Didn't help much, so maybe, just maybe, it's time for something different. And that's where you come in. You, the survivor. You, the newly valuable. You, the one with memories burned into your brain and a slightly unhinged sense of humour now. There's nothing normal about this world, and honestly, that might be the best thing about it. Historical fact time. In some towns, the mortality rate reached 70% or higher. Entire villages vanished. Just gone. Nothing left but foundations and maybe a few iron tools scattered in the dirt. In England alone, about 1.5 million people died in just 2 years. Quirky fringe fact. Some folks genuinely believed the plague was caused by an unlucky alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. Not rats, not fleas, but angry planets. You can't exactly burn the sky, but that didn't stop people from trying wild solutions, like whipping themselves in the streets or dousing their homes in rosewater and vinegar. Look, it was a weird time. And here's a hotly debated scholarly question. Did the Black Death really cause the collapse of the feudal system? Or was that already crumbling under its own weight, and the plague just gave it a fatal shove? Some historians argue that people were already sick of serfdom. The plague just made the population small enough that labourers could demand better treatment, or else walk away and find a place that valued them. Others think the system was stronger than that, and it limped along for decades more. You don't really care about the debate, though. What you care about is this. There's no one stopping you from walking into the manor house and sleeping in the Lord's abandoned bed. Maybe stealing some cheese from the cellar. Maybe planting your own wheat in the empty field behind the church. Maybe starting over. A few people emerge from the side streets, a boy with soot on his face, a woman with her arm in a sling. They nod at you, no words, just the shared look of people who've seen too much. You nod back. The sun is low, shadows stretch across the dirt road, the raven's still watching. You don't trust the future yet, but you're alive. And in this strange, post-apocalyptic version of medieval Europe, that's kind of everything. You wake up to birdsong, real, actual birdsong, and for a second you forget. You forget the plague, the silence, the aching absence of the people you once knew. But then you open your eyes, and the world outside your little borrowed cottage reminds you. The birds are louder now because there are fewer chimneys, fewer carts, fewer children chasing them away. You step out into the morning mist and the fields stretch out like blank pages. The earth is rich and undisturbed, except for the tall grasses that have taken back what once was farmland. Wheat used to grow here. Now it's mostly weeds, with a few stubborn vegetables left to grow wild where someone, somewhere, once tried to keep a garden going. And here's the twist. Nobody's telling you what to do anymore. Before the plague, your days were scripted. Up with the sun, off to work on the Lord's land, a few hours tending your own meagre garden if you were lucky. Taxes, tithes, rules, duties. You didn't get to decide much. Now? The Lord's manor is empty. No soldiers, no bailiff, no one breathing down your neck about the king's harvest or the bishop's indulgences. You spot a plough near the edge of the field. Wooden, a bit rotted, but usable. You take it, just like that. No one stops you. No one claims it. The cow you pass on the way stares at you with bored approval, as if to say, "You again?" It's a weird friendship, but these days you take what you can get. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed control. The whole machinery of medieval feudalism, those neat little boxes that decided who you were and what you could do, got shredded by a microscopic killer no one even saw coming. And here you are now, ankle-deep in mud, choosing where to plant your future. Not bad for a serf, huh? But let's talk about something real. Labour shortage. With so many peasants gone, every surviving hand became more valuable than gold. It's basic supply and demand, even if you've never heard of economics. Suddenly you're not just a worker, you're the worker, and landowners need you way more than you need them. You can practically see the desperation in the letters some lords have been sending out, written in fancy Latin by scribes who are probably dead now. Come work our fields, they say. We'll give you wages. Good wages. Maybe even a bit of land. Wages. Before the plague, the idea of getting paid actual coin to work the land was laughable. You paid them, in crops, in time, in loyalty. Now the tables are flipped. They need you, and if they don't treat you right, you walk, because somewhere else, another lord is willing to pay better. Historical fact time. In 1351, England passed the Statute of Labourers, a desperate attempt to freeze wages and force peasants back to pre-plague conditions. The law tried to make it illegal for workers to ask for higher pay or leave their assigned manors. Did it work? Not really. People ignored it. The labour market had changed, and no piece of parchment could put the genie back in the bottle. Meanwhile, you're not just working for pay now, you're making deals, trading skills, bartering for things you never could have dreamed of owning, like a second pair of shoes, or a cloak that actually keeps out the wind. Even a pewter spoon. That's practically luxury. And then there's food. Oh, the food. With fewer mouths to feed, you suddenly have access to things that used to be out of reach. Honey, dried figs, good cuts of pork. Before, you were scraping the bottom of the communal pot for turnip stew. Now you're feasting on roast pigeon with herbs you pulled from your own garden. Not every day, but often enough to forget what hunger used to feel like. Still, there's a weird guilt that creeps in when you think about it. Like, are you really allowed to be enjoying any of this? The world is still grieving, but grief doesn't fill your belly or plough your fields. So you push the guilt down, and you eat, you live. That's the quiet rebellion of the survivor. Let's get a bit quirky for a second. Did you know that in some parts of Europe, post-plague land was literally handed over to peasants in exchange for just staying there? In places like Tuscany, abandoned villas were given to anyone willing to occupy and maintain them, like a medieval version of squatters' rights with a housing bonus. You're walking through history's strangest real estate boom. But here's the catch. There's still no map for this new life. You're writing it as you go, and that's terrifying. Debate time. Some historians argue that this explosion in peasant agency was the first real shift toward capitalism in Europe, a world where your labour had value, your choices mattered, and your future wasn't chained to your birth. Others push back, saying it's too simplistic. These changes were patchy, temporary, often rolled back by desperate lords and angry kings. Maybe. But you're living the difference. As you head back toward the village, your village now, you notice something strange. A group of people gathered in the square. That's new. They're sharing news, offering help, arranging to repair a roof. It's the beginnings of something that hasn't existed here in a long time. Community. Not the kind that's dictated from above, but one that's forming from scratch. It's awkward, uneasy, but real, and you find yourself smiling. A girl with a wooden flute starts playing a tune you remember from before it all went wrong. It's a bit off-key, but it fills the air in a way that's almost magical. A few people clap. Someone laughs, like a genuine belly-deep laugh. That alone feels revolutionary. You take your place among them, not as a servant, not as someone with a last name that means of nowhere, but as someone needed, someone with value. You've gone from anonymous background character in someone else's story to, well, something more. You won't say happy ending, not yet, but it's a start. You smell it before you see it. Something sizzling, fat dripping into fire, and the unmistakable scent of roasted meat. You follow your nose around the bend in the road until you stumble onto a scene that feels like a hallucination. A man is cooking an entire pig, over an open spit in front of a half-repaired farmhouse. There's laughter, there's singing, and there's enough food to feed a dozen people. But only 4 are sitting there, each one chewing slowly as if they don't quite trust the moment. You just stand there staring like you've never seen pork before, which honestly you kind of haven't. Not like this. Before the plague, you were lucky if you got the bone. Maybe some boiled fat if you were real tight with the cook. The actual meat, that was for the Lord's table, or maybe a generous monk. Now it's you and the pig, and you get a leg. Let's talk about why that leg of pork is suddenly within your reach. It's not charity, it's economics. The price of pigs, along with just about every other foodstuff, has skyrocketed. With fewer peasants raising livestock, supply drops. Demand stays steady. Because hey, people still love bacon, and prices shoot up like a candle in a dry chapel. But here's the twist. You're no longer too poor to afford it. Because your labour is now in demand, and you've got silver jingling in your pouch to prove it. That's right. You, a peasant, are holding silver. Enough to buy meat, enough to buy shoes, enough if you're clever to buy a goat or even rent a cow for a season. Some people say it's the end times. You're thinking it might be the beginning of something else. So why does a pig cost more than a priest's blessing now? Because raising one takes time, feed, and hands, none of which are in good supply post-plague. Your friend Walter, who used to breed pigs, is now in charge of 5 farms because everyone else is dead. He can't manage them all, so his pigs are fewer, his attention thinner, and that scarcity makes the meat twice as rare and 10 times as expensive. Even salted pork, which used to be a cheap staple for winter, is now a luxury, and people are willing to pay for it. Historical fact break. In England, wages for labourers rose sharply after the plague. Between 1349 and 1351, a skilled labourer could earn almost twice what they made before. But here's the kicker. Lords and the Crown hated this. They tried to enforce wage caps, price controls, even sumptuary laws that told you what food you could eat and what clothes you could wear. The poor were suddenly eating like the middling class, and the rich were having a full-blown identity crisis about it. Which leads us to your dinner. You take your seat by the fire, accept a crust of bread, and tear into the pork like you're storming a castle. The man roasting it, thin, sunburnt, one eyebrow permanently raised, asks what you do. You tell him you're a labourer, recently free of lordship, good with a scythe, and not too bad with animals. He offers you a spot on his farm just like that. That's how it works now. There are no guilds or government offices out here. You want work, you talk, you prove you can handle a shovel without crying, and boom, you've got a bed and a breakfast. And maybe, if you play your cards right, a slice of the profits when harvest comes in. But here's something weird. All this food, it's also a symbol, a status marker. What you eat tells people where you land on the new social ladder. In the past, your entire village might have had 1 or 2 feast days a year where meat showed up. Now people are eating it regularly. Some towns even see butchers becoming important figures, local celebrities really. A guy who can source beef and not die from it, that's influence. There's even talk of butter being sold by weight now, not just bartered in back alleys. Cheese is a sign of prosperity. Ale is back in fashion, brewed stronger and darker to match everyone's mood. And bread, oh bread. Bread is no longer made with just barley or rye. You taste wheat flour for the first time, and it's like someone punched your taste buds awake. But quirky fact incoming. In some regions of Europe, laws were passed against eating too well. Not because it was unhealthy, but because it was unseemly. Imagine that. You survive a pandemic, claw your way out of serfdom, and now there's a law saying you can't wear nice buttons or eat veal because it makes the nobles look bad. In Florence, there were actual court cases against people for having too many embroidered garments or wearing colours above their station. It's petty, it's ridiculous, and it's entirely real. You glance at your companions around the fire. None of them look noble. One has a missing tooth and a face full of freckles. Another has hands so calloused they look like tree bark. And yet here you all are, dining like lords. It's not a feast, not really, but it feels like one, because it's yours. There's still tension, though. In the back of your mind, and theirs, is the creeping suspicion that someone's going to take this away, that a new tax will appear, that a knight with half a lance and a full ego will ride up and demand his due, that the church will arrive to remind you that earthly pleasures are dangerous, and pigs are for penance, not joy. Which brings us to an open debate. Was this post-plague prosperity for the poor a true shift, or a temporary bump before the elites regrouped and clamped down? Some scholars argue that the 1350s to 1380s were a brief golden window for the lower classes, a moment of mobility and leverage that soon closed again with war, legal crackdowns, and economic regression. Others say it planted seeds that kept growing into unions, revolts, even revolutions. You can't put value back in the box once people taste what freedom costs. Back at the fire, you lean back, belly full for the first time in weeks. The stars are out. Someone starts singing, a low, half-forgotten tune about foxes and fields. You hum along, not because you know the words, but because the rhythm feels like something older than words, something that survived. You know tomorrow there will be work, real work, the kind that blisters your hands and burns your back. But tonight, you eat pork by a fire with people who laugh and sing and curse and mourn. People like you, survivors, and the pig? Let's just say it didn't die in vain. The thud of a hoe hitting dry earth echoes through the field, sharp and rhythmic. You wipe sweat from your brow with a sleeve that probably hasn't been washed since Easter, but nobody's judging. It's been weeks since you moved into this half-collapsed cottage on the edge of a dying village, and you're finally starting to carve out a life. You've got a patched roof, a goat that screams at absolutely nothing, and, miracle of miracles, a tiny square of land that you get to call your own. And you're not the only one. Across the valley, smoke curls up from chimneys that hadn't seen fire in months. Survivors are trickling back, digging up old fields, salvaging broken carts, and pulling the weeds from empty homes. It's like watching civilization try to regrow itself, one anxious shovel load at a time. And you're in the thick of it. But something's shifted in the air. You're not just working, you're thinking. Because here's the secret nobody really says out loud. You're angry. A lot of people are. The plague didn't just take loved ones. It exposed just how brittle and unfair the old system was. Lords disappeared when things got bad. Priests gave last rites from across the room if they came at all. Half the people who told you your life was supposed to be full of obedience and hardship died the same as the poor, maybe even quicker. And now there's power in numbers. Word spreads fast. From village to village, people talk about how labourers are walking off manors and demanding wages, about towns where peasants are forming groups, holding meetings, and organising repairs without permission from anyone in silk, about workers who no longer bow at the gate but knock on the manor door to negotiate, or to warn. You catch wind of something stirring across the sea. England, 1381. A revolt. It starts small, whispers in fields, complaints in taverns, murmurs in the shadows of churches, but it grows, like kindling on dry wood, The peasants are done, tired of wage freezes, tired of paying taxes for a king who does nothing for them, tired of hearing that God wants them poor while bishops count gold in palaces. They rise, historical fact. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was one of the most significant uprisings in medieval England. Sparked by a hated poll tax and years of economic frustration, thousands of commoners marched on London. They burned tax records, stormed castles, and even killed officials. For a brief, blazing moment, they had the ear of the king. You hear this story from a travelling tinker who tells it like it's a legend, eyes wide with half-belief. They made the boy king promise freedom, he says, poking the fire. Said no man should be bound to labour against his will. Said we're all children of Adam, born the same. A pause. Of course, they hanged the leaders a week later. You nod, the embers of your hope a little dimmer, but not out. Because even if the revolt failed, the fact that it happened at all means something's changed. Before the plague, people might grumble, but they didn't rise. Now, rising feels possible. Quirky fact time. One of the leaders of the revolt was named Wat Tyler. That's right, Wat. Not Sir, not Lord, just Wat. And for a few fleeting days he was one of the most powerful men in England. He negotiated with the king himself. There's even an old rumour, probably made up, that he rode into London wearing armour made of stolen church silver. You kind of hope it's true, but it's not just England. Across Europe, rebellions pop up like mushrooms after rain. In France, there's the Jacquerie in 1358, where peasants armed with farm tools stormed noble estates and burned them to the ground. In Italy, the Ciompi, poor wool workers, briefly seize control of Florence in 1378. Something is happening. Something that no lord or law can quite put back in its box. So, here you are, in your little patch of field, watching the world try to rewrite itself. You feel the tremble beneath your boots, the shifting of centuries of tradition. For the first time, people like you are demanding to be seen, not just as labourers or servants, but as human beings with choices, and that scares people, because even though the nobility is weakened, it's not gone. Some are rebuilding, reinforcing, sending letters to the crown asking for order to be restored. Some are hiring mercenaries, men too desperate or too broken by war to care who they swing a sword at. You see one ride through the village one day, wearing half armour and a sneer. He doesn't say much, but he doesn't have to. His presence is a reminder. The old world isn't dead yet. Still, something in you stiffens. You've seen death, you've seen loss, and you've seen the world without lords, without bishops, without kings. It didn't fall apart. In fact, it started to heal. You start keeping your hoe a little sharper than usual. Open scholarly debate. Did the Black Death actually cause these uprisings, or did it simply speed up a process already brewing? Some historians argue that inequality and feudal pressures had been building for decades. The plague was just the match to an already dry pile of resentment. Others say the demographic collapse gave peasants a sudden and unique leverage they had never had before, and once they tasted it, they weren't going back. Back in your village, the signs of change are everywhere. People are bartering directly now. No more middlemen, no more scribes keeping tallies for absent landlords. You fix your neighbour's cart, she brings you eggs. Someone else starts brewing beer again. There's even talk of organising a shared field, common land where anyone can grow what they need. You start to wonder, is this what freedom looks like? Not parades or speeches, just a field, a roof, a choice. You spend your evenings sitting on the edge of your tiny porch, watching the sky melt into stars. Sometimes you think about the revolt in England and wonder what it felt like to march on London. Other times, you just listen to the goats scream at shadows and try not to laugh too hard with a mouthful of soup. Because the world has changed, you've changed. And the people who thought you'd stay quiet forever? They're starting to realise they were wrong. You're sitting in the back of a crumbling chapel, where the smell of damp stone and old incense hangs heavy in the air. The candles are gone, burned through or pilfered. The altar cloth is stained with mildew. And the priest. He hasn't shown up in over a week. Not that anyone's shocked. You glance around. A handful of others sit scattered across the pews, some mumbling prayers, others just sitting. Like they came here out of habit, not hope. You lean back, hands folded, and try to remember what it felt like to believe. Not believe in God necessarily, you still do, kind of, depending on the day, but to believe that the church knew anything, that its rituals mattered. that it could protect you. Spoiler, it couldn't. When the plague came, priests died just like everyone else. Maybe even faster, since they were the ones kneeling by plague beds, offering last rites, breathing in the final rasping coughs of the dying. Some were heroic, others ran. You remember one who locked the church doors and refused to see anyone, said the plague was punishment and no amount of prayer would stop it. Another took all the village silver and left under cover of night, probably still out there somewhere, trying to sell blessings to a town that hasn't caught on yet. So yeah, the church wobbled, and in a world where the church was supposed to be the rock, the foundation, the one stable institution that guided every step of your life, birth, marriage, confession, death, that wobble felt like an earthquake. Historical fact, after the Black Death, the church suffered a major credibility crisis. The sheer scale of death undermined the idea that clergy had divine protection, or that prayer could ward off illness. In many areas, the number of trained priests dropped so low that desperate bishops ordained anyone who could halfway mumble Latin, leading to a rise in unqualified, often corrupt clergy. Spiritual authority kinda took a hit. You watch as a man near the front crosses himself and whispers a prayer. His fingers twitch like he's unsure of the words, and that's how it feels now, uncertain. The rituals still happen sometimes. People still pray, but there's a hollowness to it, like going through motions in a play where everyone forgot their lines. Outside the chapel, it's even weirder. New movements are spreading like wildfire. Some people blame the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells or angering God. You've heard the rumours, seen the violence. It makes your stomach turn. These are people who were neighbours last year now being hunted like animals because the plague needed a face. Others have gone in the opposite direction, embracing the end times. They march through towns, whipping themselves in the streets, chanting hymns until they collapse from blood loss or fever, the flagellants they call themselves. Their eyes are wild, their backs are raw. They say the plague was divine punishment, and only suffering will bring salvation. Quirky fringe fact. The flagellant movement actually became so popular in the late 1340-50s that entire groups travelled across Europe in dramatic processions, beating themselves in public squares. In some towns they outdrew the church itself. Bigger crowds, louder sermons, more drama. At one point the Pope had to condemn them officially, because they were getting a bit too spicy with their apocalyptic vibes and refusing to obey clerical authority. Can't have that. And yet, part of you gets it. When the old answers fail, people reach for new ones, even if they're bloody, irrational, or completely terrifying. It's not about logic, it's about needing to believe something. You leave the chapel and head into the village square where a few folks have gathered around a travelling preacher. Not a priest. He's not wearing any robes, just a dusty cloak and a voice that could cut through fog. He speaks of repentance, yes, but also of change, of the world as it could be, a world where the church serves the people, not the other way around, where the poor aren't told to suffer silently, where salvation doesn't come with a price tag, and people are listening, really listening. You lean against a post and watch the preacher's eyes flick across the crowd. He's no saint, you can tell, but he believes what he's saying, and in a time like this, that's rare enough to feel holy. There's a slow shift happening, barely visible, like the sun inching over the horizon. Faith is no longer chained to the altar. People are praying in their homes now, in fields, under trees. They're questioning who needs the middlemen, who needs the elaborate rituals when God, if God's still watching, is clearly not playing favourites. Open scholarly debate. Some argue that this erosion of trust in the institutional church after the plague directly paved the way for later reform movements, like the Protestant Reformation. Others say the timeline's too stretched, that the church eventually recovered and even grew more powerful in some regions through stricter enforcement of doctrine and hierarchy. The truth? Probably somewhere in the messy middle, as always. Back in your own village, the local priest finally returns one day, thin, eyes sunken, robe ragged. You half expect people to run to him. Instead, they nod politely. A few ask about services. One woman asks if he still remembers Latin. A teenager snickers. That night he gives a sermon to about 7 people. You're not one of them. You stay home, sitting on the threshold of your cottage, watching the stars and trying to talk to something bigger than yourself. Not in fancy words, not with wine and wafers. Just you, the sky, and a question that hasn't been answered since the plague first touched your doorstep. Why? Why them and not you? Why now? Why this? You don't expect an answer, but you ask anyway. And in that silence, in that space where the bells used to ring, something almost sacred settles in your chest. A new kind of faith, one that's quieter. Less about obedience, more about endurance. Less about being saved, more about surviving together. You might not trust the church anymore, but you're starting to trust your neighbour. And honestly, that feels closer to divine than anything you've heard from a pulpit. You're standing in front of a wall covered in skulls. No, not a metaphor. Actual bone-white, empty-eyed skulls, stacked like firewood in an ossuary just outside town. Some are marked with paint, others with ink, names, dates, prayers, little swirls of red pigment that have long since faded to pink. A few have been arranged into neat little patterns: skull, femur, skull, femur. A surprisingly artistic form of storage, really. You breathe in slowly. The air is cool and dry in here. Stone walls, dirt floor, the smell of candle wax, and the faintest hint of old rot. This place shouldn't be comforting, but weirdly, it kind of is. Because here, death is out in the open. Not hiding, not whispered about, just stacked. Welcome to the post-plague aesthetic. Everywhere you go lately, you're noticing it. People are into death now. Or at least they're not pretending it's not part of the decor. Churches are painting frescoes of skeletons dancing with the living. Noblemen are commissioning tapestries of corpses kissing maidens. There's even a travelling play you caught once where a plague cart came on stage and started handing out black roses to the audience. Very subtle. It's not just morbid, it's trendy. And it makes sense. When you survive something as cataclysmic as the Black Death, you can't just bounce back and pretend everything's fine. The trauma sticks to you. You carry it in your dreams, in your bones, in the way your fingers twitch whenever someone coughs too close. And all of that finds a way to leak out into your clothes, your art, your music, even your jokes. Historical fact: the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular artistic theme in the years following the plague. It showed skeletons leading people of all social ranks, from kings to peasants, into the grave in a big grim conga line. It was equal parts terrifying and oddly egalitarian. Death comes for all, baby. No crown can save you now. So now people paint it, wear it, sing it. And speaking of clothes, let's talk about your outfit. You're wearing black now. Not because you're in mourning, though, I mean, you always kind of are, but because it's fashionable, death chic. Some folks wear pins shaped like coffins, others embroider little skulls onto their sleeves. If you can afford it, you get custom dye jobs for your cloaks, deep purples, reds so dark they're almost brown like dried blood. It's less Sunday best, more funeral, but make it couture. Even your neighbours are getting into it. The old woman next door, the one who never spoke before the plague, now hums softly while weaving tapestries that depict graveyards and angels with bleeding eyes. A child down the road carves little coffins out of wood scraps, complete with tiny headstones. You bought one. It sits on your shelf. And maybe the weirdest part? This all feels kind of healing. You remember what it was like during the peak of the plague. Bodies carted off at night, graves dug too shallow, people too afraid to grieve properly. Death was chaotic, terrifying, denied. Now, it's part of daily life, and somehow that makes it easier to bear. Quirky fringe fact: in some parts of Europe it became fashionable to keep memento mori, little objects meant to remind you of your inevitable death. These included skull-shaped rings, hourglasses, or tiny dolls in coffins. Wealthy folks even kept literal bones on their desks as a motivational tool. "You too will die," the bone whispered. "Better get your taxes done." Of course, not everyone's vibing with this new look. Some of the older clergy are disturbed. Too macabre, they mutter. Too irreverent. But they're the same ones who told you plague was a divine punishment and then fled to their summer homes in the hills, so you're not exactly taking their aesthetic critiques to heart. You head back into town where a new mural has popped up on the side of the bakery. It shows a skeleton offering a loaf of bread to a child who offers an apple in return. Above it, in neat black lettering, "We all feed the worms. Feed each other first." You stare at it for a while. It's morbid, sure, but also kind of sweet. Open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the post-plague obsession with death was a collective trauma response. Basically, medieval PTSD manifesting in art and culture. Others suggest it was more theological, a a shift toward focusing on the afterlife because the physical world had so thoroughly let people down. Then there are those who think it was simply fashion. Death got trendy and people ran with it. The truth is probably yes to all of it. That night you sit by candlelight and pull out the small book you've started scribbling in. Charcoal smudges, half-formed poems, weird thoughts that keep you awake. On one page you've drawn a little skeleton holding a wheat stalk. Next to it, still growing. You're not sure what you mean by it yet, but it feels true. In the distance you hear someone playing a lute. The tune is slow, a bit sad but kind. You hum along as you tidy your shelf of bones and feathers and candle stubs. Your little shrine to mortality. Your little corner of the world that reminds you how fragile and weirdly beautiful life is now. Because if you're going to live in a world haunted by death, you might as well decorate accordingly. You wake to the sound of footsteps. Light, careful, almost hesitant. You lie still for a moment, listening. Not the heavy clomp of a tax collector's boots, or the clatter of armoured patrols. No, these are the footfalls of someone walking on ground they didn't expect to own. You peek out your window, and there he is, Tobias. He's got a burlap sack slung over one shoulder and a slightly confused look on his face, like he still can't believe he's alive, let alone here. The funny part, you're standing on his land, or at least it was his father's land, before the plague. Now? Who even knows whose land is whose? You step outside and wave. He nods back, his eyes flicking toward the house you've been patching up. The house that used to belong to the steward of the local lord, now long buried in a ditch with half the manor staff. You brace for a fight, but instead he just says, "You got the roof to stop leaking?" You nod, he shrugs. Good. And that's it. That's how land inheritance works now. Awkward eye contact and silent agreements. Because there's no one left to keep track of deeds or boundaries or wills. The lawyers are dead. The scribes are dead. The people who enforced who owned what are either dead or too tired to care, and you? You might be a squatter technically, but who's squatting if there's no one left to say otherwise? Welcome to the biggest real estate reshuffle in medieval history. Historical fact. In the wake of the Black Death, massive amounts of land changed hands, often with little to no documentation. Entire family lines were wiped out, leaving property without heirs. Survivors, including former peasants, began taking over these lands, sometimes legally, sometimes not so legally. Over time, many of these squatters became the de facto owners, reshaping the very structure of rural Europe. You walk the edge of the field behind the cottage and notice the boundaries aren't marked anymore. Used to be fences, hedgerows, stone piles, symbols of ownership. Now, just space. Open. Waiting. Like the land forgot who it belonged to and is ready to start over. And you're not alone. Across the valley, people are doing the same thing. Claiming empty homes, restoring overgrown fields, ploughing soil that hasn't felt a blade in years. And some are doing better than just getting by. They're thriving. You hear about a woman named Alda in the next village over, widowed, childless, and now somehow the owner of 3 farms. Her husband died during the first wave of the plague, her brothers during the second. She inherited their plots, married again, and after he died, third wave, she just kept going. Everyone calls her Lady Alda now. Nobody questions it. That's the thing. Titles are getting slippery. Nobility used to be ironclad, passed through male heirs, certified by birth and blood. Now, it's more like whoever's still breathing and shows up first. You climb the hill that used to mark the edge of the estate lands. From here you can see the manor house. It's a hollow shell now. Roof caved in, ivy curling through the windows. A place that once hosted feasts now plays host to foxes and the occasional brave drunkard who thinks sleeping there might impress someone. It doesn't. You once would have been lashed for even looking at that hill too long. Now you sit on it and eat a plum you didn't pay for. Because the orchards are yours now, kind of. Or at least not anyone else's. Quirky fact time. Some people kept living in abandoned castles and manors for generations. In a few cases, those families eventually became the new local nobility. Not through royal favour, but because, well, they were the only ones left and had the nicest roof. In other words, they nobled their way in by squatting really, really hard. But it's not all good news. Not everyone's cool with the redistribution of property. The surviving nobility, what's left of it, is trying to reassert control. You've heard of messengers arriving in villages with wax-sealed letters from distant lords claiming land by right of birth. Most people ignore them. A few comply. Fewer still enforce them, Because honestly, who wants to fight a dozen angry peasants over some musty legal scrap that half the village can't even read? Still, you stay alert. Because land is power now. It used to be the rich had land and the poor had labour. But with labour suddenly valuable and land suddenly available, the game's changed. You're no fool. You keep quiet. You keep working. You build fences slowly, bit by bit. Not to keep people out, but to make it look official. You start calling the field mine in conversation. You joke about my chickens and my well. People hear it. And language, as it turns out, is its own kind of ownership. Open scholarly debate. Was this land grab phase a step toward modern property rights, or just a temporary breakdown of feudalism before the nobles stitched it back together? Some historians argue that it marked the rise of a proto-middle class, small landowners who didn't come from noble blood but gained wealth and status through post-plague opportunity. Others say most of the gains were short-lived, eventually clawed back by the church and crown once things stabilised. You don't care about long-term theory, though. You care about the goat that keeps escaping through the same damn hole in the fence. About the corner of the garden where the carrots actually took this year. About the pile of stones you've been collecting to build a smokehouse, if you can figure out how to do it without burning the whole house down. Tobias shows up again one morning, this time with a scythe. He doesn't say much, just gestures to the overgrown edge of the field and starts cutting. You join him, and just like that, you're working your land, together. No lords, no taxes, no overseers, just two men in a field figuring it out. And that might not seem revolutionary, but in a world still shadowed by death and memory, it kind of is. There's something off about the man standing at the edge of the village. He's got a wide-brimmed hat, a long black cloak, and most importantly a mask shaped like a bird's beak. It juts from his face like he's half man, half stork, and he's carrying a satchel full of clinking bottles and rolled-up scrolls. A few kids run behind him at a distance, laughing and pointing, but the adults just watch. Nobody knows whether to thank him or throw rocks. He's a doctor, allegedly. You've heard of these guys before. Plague doctors, they're called. Not doctors in the way we think of them now. More like bold volunteers with weak training and strong stomachs. Some were university educated. Others were literally just dudes who could read and didn't gag easily. Either way, they show up after the death. Never before. And this one's no different. You wander closer, curiosity outweighing good sense. The beaked mask is made of leather, stuffed with herbs like rosemary, myrrh, and dried rose petals. Not because it's stylish, but because everyone thinks bad smells, miasmas, cause the plague. The herbs are meant to protect him. You're not sure they're doing much. Still, he nods politely. Any recent cases? You shake your head. Not since midsummer. Good, he says. For now. That for now hangs heavy. Historical fact. The plague didn't just vanish after 1351. It came back in waves, some small, some massive. Major occurrences hit in 1361, 1369, 1375, and well into the 1400s. Each time the symptoms varied slightly, the death toll shifted, and the fear came roaring back. People started referring to it not as a plague, but the plague, like a seasonal monster that never quite died. You invite the doctor into the church, where he sets up shop under the broken rose window. He lays out his tools, small knives, cups for bloodletting, a jar of leeches, classic medieval medicine. You wince. Nobody likes these methods, but they're what people know. A woman enters, coughing lightly, and sits. He examines her eyes, checks her tongue, then prescribes a blend of herbs, garlic, and fasting. You're not sure any of it works, but the woman seems relieved just to be seen. That's the thing. The plague changed medicine, but not the way you'd hope. It exposed how little anyone actually understood the human body. 4 humours, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. That was the dominant theory. If you were sick, it was because those fluids were out of balance. Too much blood, leeches, too little, wine, fever, get whipped and avoid figs. You're not joking about the figs. In one village, figs were considered plague magnets because they were moist and vaguely fleshy. In another, people swore by onions and vinegar foot baths. No one agreed on anything, but everyone had something they trusted. Quirky fringe fact. One of the strangest cures to gain popularity after the plague was rubbing crushed emeralds on your chest. That's right. Emeralds. Wealthy nobles paid absurd amounts to grind up gemstones and press the dust into their skin, hoping it would draw out the poison. Spoiler, It didn't work. But hey, at least they sparkled. You watch the doctor burn his cloth rags in a small brazier after each visit. There's an oddly calming ritual to it. Treat, burn, breathe, treat, burn, breathe. It feels cleaner than most of what you've seen. Later he offers to examine you. Just a checkup, he says. Preventative. You agree, mostly because you're curious. He checks your pulse with 2 fingers, taps your knee with a spoon, peers into your mouth and says, "Your bile's probably fine, but your aura's very dry." You blink. "That bad?" He shrugs. "Could be worse. Eat more pears," and that's your medical advice for the week. But underneath the odd rituals and the guessing games, something else is happening. Something new. These doctors are starting to notice patterns. They're writing things down, comparing cases, trying to learn, and you can feel it in the way this one squints at his notes, draws tiny diagrams of boils and mutters things like, "Third outbreak cases present differently." It's not science. Not yet. But it's thinking. And that's different. You talk with him later over a small fire, both of you chewing on stale bread dipped in cider. He tells you about a university in Salerno experimenting with quarantine techniques, about a physician in Paris who thinks the plague spreads person to person, about a few mad alchemists in Prague who believe it's a punishment from nature, not God. People are watching now, he says, recording, comparing. We used to pray for answers. Now we're asking questions. And honestly, that's more hopeful than anything you've heard in months. Open scholarly debate. Was the Black Death truly a turning point for Western medicine? Some historians argue it shattered the illusion of medieval medical competence, forcing Europe to confront the limits of its theories. Others point out that real change was slow. Many practices stayed stuck in outdated ideas well into the Renaissance. The plague didn't so much revolutionize medicine as nudge it toward revolution, with a lot of stops along the way. Before he leaves, the doctor gives you a small cloth pouch filled with dried lavender. "Smell it when the air feels heavy," he says. "Won't save you, but it's nice." You tie it to your belt. That night, you lie in bed. The faint scent of lavender mixing with wood smoke and damp wool. You think about how death still looms, but differently now. Before, it was a storm, random and overwhelming. Now, it's a shadow that moves slowly, watchable. Something you might, just might, learn to see coming. You fall asleep with the image of that beaked mask in your mind. Oddly comforting, like a ghost that decided to become a healer instead of a hunter. You're back in the city and it's weird. You remember it being packed. Carts jammed in alleys, chickens underfoot, children dodging wheels, smells coming at you from 16 directions, none of them pleasant. Before the plague, a trip into town was like being swallowed by a living, sweaty organism. Loud, chaotic, and fully capable of robbing you blind while you bought turnips. Now, the streets feel too wide. It's not exactly empty. People are filtering back slowly, but there's a hollowness you can't ignore. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps, fewer hands banging pots from open windows. The city survived, technically, but it doesn't remember how to breathe yet. The first thing you notice is the smell. Not bad, necessarily, just different, less human. You get more wafts of damp stone, chimney soot, old iron. Some stalls are open again. Fish, cheese, spices if you're lucky. But many stand closed, boarded up with symbols chalked on the door. Some are crosses, others just X's. Markings to show who died, or maybe who's too afraid to come back. You pass a row of houses and pause at one where vines have overtaken the second floor. It looks like the building itself gave up halfway through mourning and decided to become part of the earth again. Still, life is creeping back. Children chase rats in the square. A tinker calls out his wares in a half-hearted voice. Someone plays a lute by the old wine shop, badly but enthusiastically. And a street dog, you think it's the same one from before the plague, trots past you with a sausage in its mouth like it's the mayor now. Cities didn't die, they mutated, and so did you. You stop at a stall run by a woman with a crooked smile and exactly 3 teeth. She sells you a threadbare cloak and throws in a dried apple for free. "Good face," she says, squinting at you. "Alive." It's a compliment now. Historical fact. Urban centres were hit hardest by the plague, with mortality rates reaching as high as 70% in some cities. Many municipal governments collapsed or simply stopped functioning. Entire neighbourhoods were abandoned. And yet, cities rebounded faster than rural areas in some cases. drawing in survivors looking for opportunity and escape from feudal control. That's the thing about cities post-plague. They're not just rebuilding, they're reshuffling. The people coming back aren't always the same ones who left. You meet former peasants setting up as traders, craftsmen with no apprentices now taking on anyone willing to learn, and widows who've inherited shops, homes, entire corners of the block. You hear one woman arguing with a mason, "I paid for the stone. That wall's mine." And he just nods, like it's obvious. Before, she would have needed a husband, a father, a letter of approval. Now she's got coin and a backbone and no one left to tell her no. There's something brewing here. Something urban, rough-edged, and unapologetically alive. Quirky fringe fact. In Venice, survivors of the plague created a whole new category of civic service. Plague guardians. These weren't doctors, but officials tasked with identifying symptoms, isolating the sick, and enforcing quarantine. Think medieval bouncers with clipboards. They wore distinctive uniforms and had the power to shut down entire neighbourhoods. Super fun guys at parties. You visit a friend from before, the one who used to work in a cathedral scriptorium. He greets you from behind a table covered in glass bottles and tiny measuring scales. Turns out he's taken up alchemy, not for gold or immortality, but because I want to understand why half my street is dead and I'm not. Hard to argue with that. You wander into a tavern near the city wall. It's only half full, but the energy is off, in a good way. Before, these places were all about the landed classes and the loud merchants. Now, everyone seems more equal, less flash, more grit. You hear debates about wages, trade, rent. One man insists the city should build more public fountains. Another wants free bread for orphans. Someone even mutters, "We should vote on it." You nearly choke on your cider. Open scholarly debate. Did the plague accelerate urban self-governance? Some scholars believe the loss of traditional power structures allowed cities to experiment with new forms of civic leadership, including elected councils and early merchant guild influence. Others argue this was less about democracy and more about survival. Whoever had the coin or the keys just took over. Either way, something's different. Even the buildings reflect it. You pass a new stone structure with carvings that don't look like saints or kings. They're of animals, tools, even a mother nursing a child. It's not fancy, but it's intentional. People are telling their own stories now, not just the churches or the crowns. You find yourself in the market square again, the fountains flowing. A man sits nearby painting a sign that reads, "New Start Tavern, rooms available," in careful block letters, and you realise this is what recovery looks like. Not fireworks, not parades, just one more open stall, one more repaired roof, one more person deciding to stay. You sit for a while with your dried apple, watching as someone sweeps the steps of a library that hasn't been touched in years. The broom's missing half its bristles. The person sweeping hums something tuneless and slow. You hum along. Because this city may never be what it was, but it might become something better. You're standing in front of a tailor's shop staring at a sign that reads, "No velvet unless you own land." It's painted in bright red letters on a board so fresh you can still smell the pitch in the wood. A small parchment beneath it lists forbidden fabrics, colours and embellishments. Silk? Nope. Scarlet dyes? Off limits. Fur trim? Only if you're a noble, or at least pretend to be one really convincingly. You blink. Apparently your new boots are considered too nice for someone of your station. And suddenly you're laughing. This dry, surprised little wheeze of a laugh that turns heads. Because for a hot second after the plague, it felt like the world had flipped, right? The rules didn't just bend, they broke. Peasants wearing embroidered cloaks, widows owning property, shepherds drinking out of pewter goblets. It was chaos, glorious, strange, liberating chaos. But the powers that be? Yeah, they're not loving it. Welcome to the great post-plague fashion crackdown. Historical fact. After the Black Death, European governments, especially in England, France and parts of Italy, issued a flurry of sumptuary laws. These were rules about who could wear what, eat what, and even furnish their homes with certain items. The idea was to preserve social order and stop peasants from dressing or living like the nobility. Because nothing says fragile hierarchy like being terrified of someone else's fancy shoes. The tailor pokes her head out of the shop. She eyes your boots. "You work the land?" she asks. You nod. She raises an eyebrow. "Those aren't turnip-digging shoes." You shrug. "They were a gift." from the man whose ox I helped pull out of the river. That's only half true, but she accepts it. Barely. And you both know the real crime here isn't theft or vanity. It's aspiration. See, you and a lot of others, survivors, workers, weirdly rich ex-serfs, have started looking different. Better clothes, cleaner homes, rings with glass stones, coats with buttons, not strings. And that's freaking out the upper classes who are suddenly finding themselves indistinguishable from the people who used to bow to them. And that's not all they're trying to clamp down on. You pass a new town notice on the church door. No labourer shall wear silk or velvet. No woman of common birth shall wear gold jewellery. No man under the rank of knight shall wear red or blue cloth dyed with indigo. Anyone caught wearing unauthorised colours may be fined or publicly shamed. You stare at it and wonder who's going to enforce this. The tailor? The widow who now owns 3 fields and rides a horse with actual stirrups? You hear she wears green every Sunday. Dark green. Almost emerald. Scandalous. Quirky fringe fact. In Florence, laws went so far as to limit how many pleats a dress could have based on social class. You heard that right. Pleats. Apparently, if your tunic draped too fancily, it was considered a threat to the entire social order. In Venice, a baker was fined for wearing a crimson doublet on the wrong day. Tailors were caught altering garments to look nobler, and some were even jailed for their stitching crimes. It'd be funny if it weren't so desperate. You walk through the market, noting how many people aren't obeying. A weaver wearing a feathered cap, a blacksmith in a finely dyed red shirt, a teenager with an ostentatious belt buckle that screams, "Please notice I'm still alive and maybe mildly important now." And you realise this isn't just about fashion, it's about visibility. After losing half the population, survivors aren't content to fade back into the background. They want to be seen, valued, respected, and maybe a little envied. And this threatens everything the nobility believed about themselves. Open scholarly debate. Were sumptuary laws actually enforced in a meaningful way, or were they more symbolic, aspirational guardrails for a social order already in decline? Some historians argue they were largely ignored, especially in cities where enforcement was spotty, and the middle class was rising fast. Others say the laws were part of a longer game, used to gradually pressure people back into old roles through fines and public shaming. Either way, they didn't work as well as intended. You duck into a cloth shop just out of curiosity. The merchant smiles. We've got new dyes from the east. Indigo, saffron, madder root. Bit expensive, but worth it if you've got the coin. You glance at the sign hanging behind her. We don't ask about status. We ask about silver. You smirk. Times are changing. You buy a scrap of dark blue wool. You don't know what you'll do with it yet. Maybe line your sleeves. Maybe wrap it into a scarf. But you'll wear it. And when someone squints at you sideways, you'll say, "I survived the plague. I'll wear what I want." That night, as you sit with your neighbours around a fire, you notice how everyone's dressed a little differently than before. The old man who used to wear the same burlap tunic now has a cloak with a clasp. The carpenter has actual shoes, stitched leather, not just bound rags. And the young woman who buried her entire family, she wears a chain around her neck with a carved wooden locket. No one says anything, but we all notice. It's not vanity, it's a reminder that we're still here, still standing, and maybe, just maybe, we're no longer playing by the old rules. The sound of coins clinking in your pouch feels weird. It's not heavy, just 5, maybe 6 silver pieces, but enough to make your steps feel different. Confident almost. Not in a buy a castle kind of way, but definitely in a get the good bread at market kind of way. You pause at a roadside inn, glance at the menu chalked sloppily on a wooden board, and order soup with meat. The woman behind the counter doesn't even blink. You pay, you sit, and a bowl is placed in front of you with what looks like an actual shred of ham floating in it. You take a bite and do something completely unexpected. You sigh contentedly. This is new. Before the plague, you worked dawn to dusk, then dusk to near collapse, and in return got a cracked bowl of porridge and the promise of heaven. Now, you're getting wages, real ones. In silver, not just bread, not just the privilege of working the Lord's land and dying on it. The shift is slow, uneven, full of loopholes, but it's happening. You can feel it in the weight of your coin pouch. You can feel it in your back, which hurts a little less knowing you're not just a disposable tool anymore. You're not rich, but you're not a serf anymore either. Historical fact. After the Black Death, the labour shortage gave surviving workers serious leverage. With half the workforce gone, landowners were desperate. They offered wages to keep peasants from moving away. In some regions of England, daily wages for agricultural labourers doubled. The old system of unpaid feudal service began to crumble under economic pressure, even if the lords tried to tape it back together. You hear stories from neighbouring towns. A ploughman who now makes more than the reeve, a stable boy who started charging knights for grooming their horses, a baker who paid off his debt and bought his own oven. You also hear about the backlash. The nobles don't like what's happening. The church doesn't either. The idea that you, someone born to labour, should expect money, or heaven forbid, a choice, is shaking the bones of the old world. So they're fighting back. You've seen the new rules nailed to church doors and market gates. No man shall demand more than the wage he received in the year of our Lord 1346. It is unlawful for a villain to leave his master's land in search of higher wages. Excessive pay is a sin of pride and shall be punished accordingly. You snort into your soup. Excessive pay? You're buying one bowl of soup with meat. This isn't a coronation. Quirky fringe fact. In parts of England, lords began offering signing bonuses to labourers who agreed to work their lands, extra grain, clothing, even chickens. One letter records a nobleman trying to poach a ploughman by offering him 2 pence more per week, a cloak at Michaelmas, and his own stool at the fire. The idea of poaching a ploughman? Unthinkable 20 years ago. Hilarious now. You finish your meal, toss a coin on the table and head outside. The sky's grey but not threatening. You pass a group of labourers gathered in a huddle near the mill. One of them sees you, nods, then says, "We're talking about setting a fair rate for harvest season." You in? You blink. A fair rate. Like negotiation. You step closer. The plan's simple. No one works for less than 4 pence a day. If the lords don't like it, they can harvest the damn barley themselves. It's risky, illegal even, but you agree, because you've done the math. You've seen the empty manor houses, the fields overrun with weeds, the desperation in the eyes of the men who used to scowl down from horseback. They need you, more than ever, and you're done pretending they don't. Open scholarly debate. Was this shift from feudal labour to wage labour the true beginning of capitalism? Some scholars think so, that the economic aftermath of the Black Death broke the rigid caste-based model of work and created a market-driven society. Others argue that while wage labour increased, most of Europe remained deeply hierarchical for centuries. The Black Death may have cracked the wall, but it didn't bulldoze it. That evening you help a neighbour thatch his roof. He hands you 2 coins and a hunk of cheese without being asked. The next day, you help a widow dig a garden bed and she offers you a pair of hand-stitched gloves in return. Wage labour isn't just about silver, it's about value. You help, you get helped, you work, you earn. And there's a dignity in that. A quiet kind of justice that feels almost revolutionary. Even your posture's different now. You walk taller, speak clearer. You've stopped ducking your head when nobles ride past, because now, if they want their orchard pruned or their chimney swept or their fields ploughed, they'll need to ask, politely, and pay up. You pass the reeve on your way home, a man who used to bark orders and write your name on lists with the same glee some folks used to light torches. He eyes you warily. Maybe it's the cloak. Maybe it's the coin pouch. Maybe it's just the fact that you don't flinch anymore. He doesn't say a word. Neither do you. Because wages, they don't just buy soup, they buy space, choices, the ability to look a man like him in the eye and say, if not out loud, at least in your bones, "I'm not yours anymore." You're standing in a doorway that doesn't quite belong to you. Technically it's your cousin's house. Or, well, it was. He died in the second wave of plague, along with his wife and their 2 children. You came to help bury them, and then you never really left. You patched the roof, you swept the hearth, you started tending the garden behind the cottage, the one with the crooked stone wall and the rosemary bush that somehow survived everything. Now it's your home, more or less. And that's how it works these days. Families aren't what they used to be. Before the plague, you could name your relatives back 3 generations, no problem. You had a dozen cousins within walking distance, aunts who fed you, uncles who scolded you, grandparents who told stories while shelling peas by the fire. You had a tree, a network, roots. Now, you've got ghosts and guesses. Half your family is gone. The other half is scattered across what used to be kingdoms, and now feel more like graveyards with roads. You hear rumours. Your older brother might be alive in a city near the coast. Your niece was seen travelling with a group of merchants heading east. but you don't know for sure, and there's no one to write letters anymore, so you start over. Historical fact. The Black Death decimated not just individuals, but lineages. Entire families were wiped out, leaving property, businesses, and even children without clear heirs. In many places, laws had to be rewritten to account for mass orphanhood and sudden inheritance. Widowhood skyrocketed, and blended families became far more common as survivors pieced together new households from whoever was left. Take your neighbour Sabina. She's living with her dead husband's cousin's daughter and a stonemason who was supposed to marry someone else before the plague took her. They're not a traditional family, not by the old standards, but they work. They raise chickens. They keep each other warm. They survive. You two are slowly building something new. There's a boy staying with you now. He's not yours, not by blood, but he showed up one evening with a donkey and a basket of bruised apples and said his village no longer existed. You let him sleep in the barn at first. Now he sleeps by the hearth and calls you uncle, even though you're not related and barely older than he is. It's strange how fast people stitch together new bonds when the old ones unravel. Quirky fringe fact. In some parts of Europe, local councils began officially recognising plague families. Informal households created in the aftermath, often without legal or church approval. These groups shared work, land, and caregiving responsibilities. Some even signed contracts with each other, promising loyalty and shared inheritance. It was community by necessity, but also innovation. People built families when theirs were gone. One day a man shows up at your door with a legal-looking document. He says he's your cousin's distant uncle through marriage, claims he has a right to the house. You let him talk. Then you show him the firewood you chopped, the patched roof, the goats in the pen, and the child sleeping inside. He looks around and nods. I'll find somewhere else. That's how inheritance works now, too. Show up, hold the place, keep it alive. That's worth more than blood at this point. Still, it's not easy. You've been to funerals where the coffin held the last person with a particular name. You've watched people bury their own children, then move into the house next door because the silence was too loud. You've met people who don't remember their real birthdays anymore. Their families are gone. Their church records were lost. Their stories are missing pages. And somehow, you adapt. Open scholarly debate. Some historians argue the social disintegration caused by the Black Death led to a deeper sense of individualism in Europe. Without fixed family roles and inherited identities, people began defining themselves in new ways, through occupation, personality, even ideology. Others argue the opposite, that the trauma pushed people into tighter communities, forging stronger local ties and more fluid family structures out of desperation. Either way, the old model cracked. You think about your own identity sometimes, how it's shifted. You used to be so-and-so's nephew, the younger son of that farmer, the boy who always dropped the pails. Now you're just you, a name, a face, a survivor, and you're building something. Every morning you and the boy, his name's Davy by the way, he told you last week, wake up and tend to the chickens. He sings while collecting eggs, horribly off-key. Then you both water the garden, repair fences, and barter with neighbours. He asks questions about your past, your old family, the people who used to sit around your table. You tell him what you can. He listens. Then he tells you about his mother, and how she made the best cheese in the village, and how she used to braid his hair when he was little. You braid it for him one evening just because he asked. Neither of you say anything after, but something settles in the silence, something good. Because family isn't always about blood anymore, it's about choosing. You've chosen each other, and that counts. That night by the fire you carve a piece of wood into a little fox. Davy likes foxes. You hand it to him. He grins like you handed him the moon. Then he gives you a drawing, charcoal on bark, of your cottage with smoke curling from the chimney and two figures sitting outside. One tall, one short, both smiling. It's ugly and perfect. And maybe that's what family looks like now. You never thought you'd get along with a merchant. Before the plague, merchants were the punchline of every bitter peasant joke. Flashy coats, smug grins, riding into town twice a year to sell you things you couldn't afford and judge you for smelling like compost. You avoided them, resented them, sometimes even overcharged them for eggs just to feel something. But now, you're sitting beside one, drinking cider out of mismatched mugs and talking about wool prices like your old friends. Because something's changed, and it's not just you, it's the entire middle of society. The merchant across from you, Adelard he says, though you're not sure if that's his name or just a name he likes, is the son of a wool trader. He used to ride with his father, mostly staying quiet and trying not to sneeze on noblemen's boots. Now, his father's gone, and he's the one with the cart, the coin, and the connections. Not bad for someone who used to sleep in the straw with the mules, he grins. He's not rich exactly, but he's not poor either. He wears a tunic dyed in real indigo, which used to be a noble exclusive colour. Now it just means he knows a guy in Bruges. His boots are clean, his fingers have ink stains, contracts he tells you, and he actually pays for his food. No threats, no favours, just coin. And here's the wild part. You're both doing well, different paths, same result. You're farming land that used to belong to a steward. He's trading goods across towns that used to be closed off by noble tolls. Neither of you technically should be here. And yet, here you are. Historical fact. In the decades after the Black Death, a new middle class began to take shape in Europe. With traditional power structures weakened, survivors with access to land, skills, or trade networks began to accumulate wealth and influence. Townsfolk, merchants, artisans, and even some former serfs began to blur the line between commoner and noble. The economy didn't just recover, it started to pivot. And it's not just Adelard. You meet a woman named Jacoba who runs a small linen shop in town. Her husband died during the first wave. She took over the books, kept the looms spinning, and now owns 2 shops. She employs 3 weavers and keeps a sword behind the counter, not for decoration. You don't ask questions. She's not a lady by title, but everyone calls her Mistress Jacoba anyway. There's a brewer in the next village over who used to scrub floors in a monastery. When the monks started dying, he took over the brewing. Now he sells ale so strong it can start theological arguments. People travel 2 towns over just to buy a jug. These aren't lords or clergy, they're not royalty. But they have something new, agency, and maybe more importantly, respect. Quirky fringe fact. In some cities like Ghent and Florence, merchant guilds rose to such power after the plague that they began making political decisions usually reserved for nobles. Some even printed their own coins, hired their own guards, and sponsored public festivals. A butcher's son could end up running a city council. No title needed, just wealth, popularity, and maybe a couple of well-fed guards. Back at the cider table, Adelard pulls out a wax tablet and scratches some numbers into it with a stylus. He's calculating grain futures. You pretend to understand, but mostly you're admiring how fast his fingers move. He looks up. You could sell cheese, you know. You blink. What? He shrugs. You've got goats. Good grassland. I've tasted your curd. People in the city would pay for that. You stare at him, confused. No one's ever suggested you sell anything outside your village. Trade networks were for nobles and merchants, not you. You were supposed to give your surplus to the manor in exchange for not being evicted. Now someone's telling you that you can export? Think about it, he says, sipping. I can take a basket next week, no charge. Just to see. Open scholarly debate. Did the post-plague rise of the middle class mark the beginning of Europe's transition from a feudal economy to an early capitalist one? Some scholars say yes, pointing to the explosion of independent trade, urban entrepreneurship, and guild-driven politics. Others argue it was a temporary rebalancing, an emergency adaptation, not a full-blown system shift. Either way, the rules were bending. That night you walk home with a head full of possibilities. You pass a house that used to belong to a knight. It's boarded up, overgrown, no one's claimed it. The idea crosses your mind. What if someone turned it into a shop, or a school, or a cheese market with a name like the Noble Goat? You laugh. A shop. You. That's ridiculous. Or is it? The next morning, Davy asks what you're smiling about while stirring goat milk in a pot. Thinking of selling cheese, you say. He looks at you like you've lost your mind. To who? To people who don't know what good cheese tastes like yet. And that's how your first export begins. Not with fanfare or banners, just with a half-filled basket, a shrug, and a merchant named Adelard who's always on the road. You're not becoming a noble, you're not trying to be, but for the first time in your life you're part of something bigger. A system where what you do matters more than where you were born. Where someone with a goat and a dream can maybe, sell to a city you've never even seen. And honestly, that's more thrilling than any title. You've barely stepped off the cart before you feel it. That tight, buzzing energy humming through the air. Not excitement. Not even fear exactly. More like a room full of people holding their breath at the same time. The city gates close behind you, and you start to see why. The streets are tense, quieter than you remember. Doors are bolted, windows shuttered. On the church wall, someone's painted a symbol in red, a circle broken through by a single line with a smear of ash below it. You've never seen it before, but something about it makes your skin crawl. You follow the merchant cart into the square, where two guards in mismatched armour eye everyone like they're trying to guess who's about to confess a crime. Adelard lowers his voice beside you and mutters, "Don't mention you're new." "Why not?" He doesn't answer. You ask someone else. A weaver, leaning on a cart stacked with damp wool. She flicks her eyes around and whispers, "They found a poisoned well 2 towns over." "Poisoned?" she nods. "They say it was the Jews." "Ah, that explains the tension." Historical fact. During and after the Black Death, Jewish communities across Europe were falsely accused of poisoning wells, spreading plague, and conspiring against Christian populations. These accusations led to horrific violence. Entire Jewish communities were massacred, expelled, or burned alive. In Strasbourg, for example, over 900 Jews were killed in a single day in 1349. Many were offered the option to convert or die. You'd like to believe people are smarter than that now. But you've seen the way grief warps logic. When people don't understand what's killing them, they start looking for someone to blame. Anyone. And if those people already live on the edges of society, if they speak differently, worship differently, bury their dead differently, well, that's all the excuse some folks need. You ask around gently, too gently maybe. People notice. A man in a grey cloak bumps your shoulder and mutters, "Keep asking those kinds of questions, you'll disappear." Later that day, a woman is dragged through the square. She's crying, clothes torn, one shoe missing. The crowd is small but loud. "She sheltered them," someone yells. "Protected them in her cellar." You freeze. You want to help, but no one moves. No one speaks. The guards don't even look interested. Adelard grabs your arm and pulls you back. "Not our fight," he hisses, but his eyes look sick. That night, you sit in the upstairs room of a small inn, unable to sleep. Outside you hear shouting, wood splintering, glass breaking. You don't open the shutters. The next morning the market reopens like nothing happened. But you notice the stall where the spice seller used to sit is gone. So is the old moneylender who always wore the same green hat, and the woman who made the best almond cakes this side of the river. Her shop's door hangs open, swinging in the breeze. They're just gone. Quirky fringe fact. In several parts of Europe, Jews were forcibly relocated into separate walled quarters, or ghettos, decades before the term officially took hold. Some of these enclosures were justified as safety measures to prevent unrest. Others were just the easiest way to isolate and control a population that had already been dehumanized by plague paranoia. You return home a few days later, basket lighter than usual, heart heavier than you expected. You don't talk about what you saw for a while. You just tend your goats, churn your cheese, braid Davy's hair when he asks. You try to slip back into the rhythm of a life that isn't tilting sideways, but the shadow follows you. One night, sitting by the fire, Davy asks, "What happened in the city?" You pause, stir the pot, then say, "They were afraid, and they hurt people because of it." He nods. That's the whole answer. He doesn't ask more. Open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the violence against Jews during and after the plague wasn't spontaneous, but part of a broader strategy by local authorities to redirect blame and reinforce political control. Others believe it was a raw explosion of fear and superstition, encouraged, but not always orchestrated, by those in power. Either way, the pattern is painfully clear. When the world broke, people found old scapegoats to sacrifice. You think back to your time in the city and remember one man, a tanner, who quietly slipped bread to a child hiding in an alley. You remember the older woman who whispered to you that not everyone believes the rumours. And you remember Adelard shaking, saying, "Not our fight," and then leaving a sack of coin in an empty doorway before you rode out of town. Not everyone gave in, not everyone chose silence. And maybe that's the point. After a world-shattering plague, you'd think the hardest part would be rebuilding houses, healing bodies, learning to live again. But no, the hardest part is deciding who will be in the aftermath. You look at Davy, curled up near the fire, and you wonder what kind of world he'll grow into. Maybe one where blame doesn't come first. Maybe one where people remember how quickly fear can turn into cruelty. You hope so. And in the meantime, you keep your door open, your ears sharp, and your courage simmering just beneath your ribs. Because the next time someone goes missing, You're not going to stay silent. You wake up with a dream still clinging to your chest. Something about fire in the sky and snakes in the river. You shake it off, stretch, and step outside into the dawnlight, but the feeling won't go. Something in the air feels off. Davy is already awake, barefoot, staring at the horizon. He squints. Did you see it last night? You blink. See what? The red star. The one that doesn't twinkle. Ah, that again. You sigh, gently. Because lately everyone's seeing things. Signs. Omens. Clouds shaped like angels. Frogs that croak at midnight. Wheat that bends in the wrong direction. People are looking for meaning anywhere they can find it. Because if the plague was a message, then surely something else is coming next. Or so they say. You can't go a week without hearing a new prophecy. There's a man who wanders from village to village with a wooden staff and a sack full of bones, yelling that the sky will split open by Michaelmas. A woman in the next town over insists the moon blinked at her. A boy saw 2 cats fighting in the shape of a cross and fainted. And honestly, you get it. Because when death knocked on every door and most people had no answers, they started asking different questions. Not why the plague happened, but what it meant. Historical fact. In the decades after the Black Death, Europe saw an explosion of apocalyptic thinking. People became obsessed with signs, portents, and the idea that the plague was not just a punishment, but a warning. Astrologers, mystics, and prophets gained new influence. Religious radicals predicted the end of days. Entire cult-like movements emerged promising redemption, revenge, or survival. One afternoon, you head into town and find a group of people standing around a well, heads tilted up, mouths half open. A travelling astrologer is waving a brass pointer at the sky, explaining how the conjunction of Saturn and Mars in the House of Pisces means something massive is coming. You catch a word that makes your blood run cold. Return. Plague. Again? The crowd gasps. A woman starts to cry. You watch the astrologer pocket a few coins and dramatically sigh. All we can do now is prepare. Quirky fringe fact. One of the more popular medieval plague theories blamed a 1345 planetary alignment. Scholars from the University of Paris declared that the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars had corrupted the air with mortal vapours. This was widely accepted and republished for decades. Entire treatises were written to track the stars in hopes of predicting the next outbreak. Davy asks you later, do you think the sky made the plague? You want to laugh, but he's serious. You shake your head. No, but people need something to blame when everything breaks. He nods slowly. Then, after a pause, I don't like Mars. Fair, but it's not just the stars. People are starting to talk about miracles too. The wooden statue of the Virgin Mary was found crying in a burned church. A man in Avignon swears he survived the plague by eating only boiled dandelions and praying at the same hour every day. Pilgrims are flocking to wells, springs, shrines, anywhere hope might have once stood. And if you think that sounds harmless, consider this. Some people have started walking across countries barefoot, whipping themselves in public squares, chanting hymns in perfect unison. The flagellants again. Not gone, just quieter now, like embers under ash. You saw one pass by the cottage last week. He didn't speak, just kept walking, eyes hollow, robes blood-stained from his own back. Open scholarly debate. Was the rise of mystical and fringe belief systems after the plague a sign of deepening religiosity, or the opposite? Some historians believe the trauma pushed people closer to faith, but in more personal, unorthodox ways. Others argue that institutional religion was so discredited that people latched onto anything else. Superstition, astrology, radical sects. It's likely both. A spiritual free-for-all in a world where answers were in short supply. You find yourself doing small things, touching the doorframe 3 times before entering, tying a red thread around your wrist during the sickly seasons, refusing to plant carrots on Thursdays. Don't ask, it's a local thing. You don't believe in these rituals exactly, but they feel safe. And that's the point, right? You hear whispers about a group living in the forest, people who've sworn off cities entirely. They grow herbs, live by moon cycles, and interpret dreams like holy texts. They have no church, no leaders, just belief. Not the old kind, the new kind, made from scraps. One day, a stranger arrives at your gate. A young man in grey robes, calm voice, soft hands. He offers a charm, wood carved into a spiral, meant to protect the home from airborne rot. You almost say no, but Davy is watching, so you buy it. 2 coppers, you hang it over the hearth just in case. Later, Davy asks, "Does it work?" You shrug. It can't hurt. You don't really believe, but belief isn't the point anymore. It's comfort. It's control. In a world that turned upside down, people are grabbing for anything that might steady it. You go to sleep that night with the charm swinging slightly in the breeze, casting strange little shadows on the wall. You stare at it, the spiral turning slowly, and wonder what you'd do if the plague did come back. Would you run? Would you fight? Would you look to the sky for answers? You're not sure. But you understand now why people are looking at stars and cats and clouds and crying statues. Because when the world falls apart once, you survive. When it might fall apart again, you start listening for warnings, even in the nonsense. You're staring at a painting and it's staring back at you. It's hanging on the wall of the tiny church in the next village over. You only came in to get out of the rain, but now you're frozen in front of it, watching as a skeleton in a tattered robe gently takes the hand of a crowned king. The 2 of them are dancing, twirling across a field of bones under a sky full of stars. The king's crown is slipping. The skeleton is smiling. It's not subtle. At the edge of the scene, a child joins them. Then a nun, a knight, a merchant, a peasant, all of them holding hands with death, spinning in a grotesque little conga line of inevitability. The brushstrokes are rough, but the message is clear. Nobody escapes, and you kind of love it. Because for the first time in your life, you see yourself in the art. Before the plague, religious paintings were filled with saints, angels, gilded halos, and nobility who paid to be painted looking righteous. You were either a background blur or not there at all. Now, death has made you the main character. Historical fact, the Danse Macabre, Dance of Death, became a wildly popular artistic motif in post-plague Europe, especially in the 15th century. Murals, manuscripts, stained glass, and woodcuts show death leading people from all walks of life, rich, poor, clergy, royalty, children, into the grave. It was a brutally democratic concept. Death didn't care who you were. And neither did art anymore. You keep staring at the painting until a priest coughs behind you. You jump a little. "She did it in 2 days," he says. "A girl from the village. Lost her parents." You glance at him. He's not much older than you. Eyes tired, robe patched. He offers a soft smile. "She said it was the only way she knew how to remember them." That makes your throat tighten. Art is grief. Art is memory. Art is a middle finger to the universe. You stay longer than you mean to. And when you leave, you start seeing art everywhere. There's a carving above the baker's door. A plague cart lovingly etched with delicate faces and hollow eyes. Someone painted tiny skeletons on the cornerstones of the town hall. A butcher's daughter is sewing black thread into white fabric, forming shapes that look suspiciously like ribs and skulls. It's not morbid, it's beautiful, honest, quirky fringe fact. Memento mori, remember you must die, became a full-on trend after the plague. People wore jewellery with skulls, collected tiny death-themed trinkets, and commissioned portraits of themselves standing beside coffins or holding hourglasses. In one German town, a wealthy merchant paid to have his tombstone carved before he died, depicting his future corpse grinning inside the grave, as if to say, "Told you so." You visit a small chapel near a hillside monastery. The walls are covered in frescoes, all of them grim and gorgeous, rotting corpses, blindfolded angels, worms curling through royal robes. A friar tells you, it's not to frighten, it's to teach humility. But you know better. It's not just humility, it's honesty. Art is finally saying the quiet part out loud. Death is coming for all of us, and pretending otherwise didn't save anyone last time. There's freedom in admitting it. You get back home and start carving again. You used to whittle little toys, foxes and chickens, and once, disastrously, a horse that looked more like a potato. But now you try something different. A skull. Just a small one, no bigger than your fist. You shape the eyes, the jaw, the curve of the cranium as Davy watches. "It's creepy," he says. You nod. "Yeah, but it's true." Later he tries carving one himself. His has ears. You don't correct him. Open scholarly debate. Some art historians argue that post-plague European art marked the beginning of a transition toward realism. With idealized religious iconography feeling empty in the face of such massive death, artists began exploring human suffering, mortality, and emotional expression more directly. Others counter that this shift was temporary, a cultural venting that passed once things stabilised. But the emotional power of those Plague-era pieces? Still undeniable. You hang your little carved skull above the hearth, not to scare, not even to remember, just to acknowledge. This is the world now. Life and death side by side, dancing. Davy gives it a name. Sir Grin. You give him a look. That's ridiculous, he shrugs. He looks like a Sir Grin. You make him a little skeleton dog to go with it. Because why not? You notice something too. People are laughing more. The jokes are darker, sure, like way darker, but laughter still happens. Gallows humour, they call it. Someone at the tavern swears they buried a man with his own wine barrel, so he doesn't get thirsty waiting for the resurrection. Another claims his uncle tried to bribe death with cheese. Didn't work. But he tried. It's all absurd, it's all hilarious, and necessary. Because art isn't just a painting, it's the story you carve, the joke you make, the song you hum while digging potatoes. It's how people process what they can't fix. And in a world that's still haunted, people need to make things again. Not just houses and fences, but meaning. You sit by the fire one night, turning a piece of wood over in your hands. You're not sure what it'll become yet. Maybe another skull. Maybe a saint. Maybe something entirely new. But you're starting to understand what that girl in the church was doing, painting the skeletons and the stars. She wasn't just remembering the dead. She was making space for the living. You're holding a hoe that doesn't belong to you. Not in a you stole it kind of way. It belonged to the farmer who used to live 2 hills over. He didn't make it through the second wave, and after a year of wind and rain, most of his tools were rusting in the shed. So you took them, cleaned them, sharpened them, started using them like they were always meant to end up in your hands. And this hoe, it's different. Not homemade. Not a splintered old thing bound with string. This one's been reforged. Sharper, flatter, better weight. Somebody added an iron strip down the neck for stability. You'd call it elegant, if elegant applied to something that digs up onions and horse manure. It's not just the tools that are changing, it's everything about farming. Before the plague, the fields were packed. Whole families worked shoulder to shoulder, picking weeds and hauling stones for landlords who barely noticed if you keeled over mid-harvest. Techniques were old, passed down, and mostly unchanged since your great-great-grandfather's day. If something didn't work, you prayed harder. Now you try things. Because the pressure's on, and also off somehow. With half the population gone, there's space. Land that was never farmed before is up for grabs. Hillside terraces, abandoned orchards. You've seen a woman planting beans inside the crumbled ruins of a chapel, sunlight pouring through a hole in the ceiling. You've seen sheep grazing where kings once held tournaments, and you've seen results. Historical fact. After the Black Death, European agriculture underwent subtle but significant shifts. With fewer labourers available, there was a move toward more efficient land use and less labour-intensive crops. Marginal lands were abandoned, crop rotations improved. Some regions shifted from grain production to livestock grazing, especially sheep. More wool, less back-breaking work. It wasn't a full-on agricultural revolution, but it was a definite upgrade. You're standing in a field now that used to grow barley. The soil's dry, uneven. Before, no one would have bothered. But you heard a travelling monk talk about fallow cycles, how land needs to rest, how compost can heal it, how cover crops like clover and peas bring nutrients back. So you try it, you scatter beans in rows and wait. When they sprout, green and defiant, you feel something shift inside you, like, oh, the land can get better, it just needs someone to listen. There's a word you've been hearing more and more lately, innovation. It doesn't roll off the tongue easily, but you like the idea behind it. New methods, new tools, people starting to think about farming, instead of just surviving it. You've got neighbours experimenting too. One guy's rigged a pulley system for drawing water from his well. Another is breeding sturdier sheep by selecting the ones that survive the winter best. It's all trial and error. But that's kind of the fun now. Failure doesn't mean death anymore. It just means try something else. Quirky fringe fact. Some farmers in the late 14th century began using horse collars and heavy ploughs more efficiently, which allowed for deeper tilling of northern European soil. While these tools existed before the plague, the new economic reality made their adoption necessary. Fewer hands meant every horse, and every tool had to work harder and smarter. And then there's the scythe. You got a new one. Not new, but different. Longer blade, curved slightly, cuts smoother. Your back hurts less. Your time in the fields is cut in half. You show it off to your neighbour and he stares like you've just invented fire. He borrows it, then makes one of his own. And that's the thing. Ideas are spreading now. Not just by nobles, not by monks tucked away in scriptoria, but by you, by farmers, shepherds, crafty widows who figure out how to make irrigation ditches from old wine barrels. Open scholarly debate. Did the post-plague period truly spark agricultural innovation, or were these changes just the natural progression of trial and necessity? Some scholars argue that the combination of labour shortage, land surplus and shifting economics forced innovation in ways the rigid pre-plague system couldn't allow. Others caution against over-romanticising it. Yes, change happened, but it was messy, uneven, and often forgotten again once the pressure eased. You don't care what they call it. You just know that when you pull up a turnip now, it's your turnip, grown in a plot you chose, with tools you repaired, using a method you decided to try, because no one's breathing down your neck with a stick and a tax collector. It's freedom with dirt under its fingernails. Later that week you help Davy build a compost pile. He gags at the smell naturally. You laugh and tell him it's the scent of tomorrow's carrots. He rolls his eyes, but you see him checking the temperature of the pile the next day, poking it with a stick and muttering like some kind of muck sorcerer. You tell him about crop rotation. He tells you that he's naming the compost heaps a stinks-a-lot. Seems fair. You mark your fields with stones now. Neat little lines. No one told you to. You just want to know where the beans end and the onions begin. There's a pleasure in it. Order where there used to be only urgency, and at the edge of the garden you plant something new, saffron. You don't know if it'll work. The soil's dry. The bulbs were expensive. But if it grows, it could be worth 10 times what wheat is worth at market. You smile at the absurdity of it. A former serf growing saffron like a spice lord. Why not? You go inside, hand stained with soil, and jot down a few notes on a scrap of parchment. What worked? What didn't? What to try next season? You're not just surviving anymore. You're farming. And farming, it turns out, is kind of an art. You're lying on your back in the grass, chewing on a stem of clover, staring up at a sky that feels too big. It's late spring, warm enough to sweat during the day, but still cold at night if you forget to stack enough firewood. Davy is asleep under a tree, snoring like a piglet, a half-eaten hunk of cheese by his side. The goats are nearby, lazy and content. Everything is calm, but your mind won't sit still. You're thinking about ships, about spices you've never tasted and languages you've never heard, about places across mountains, beyond forests, over the sea, because lately everyone's talking about somewhere else. You've heard stories at the tavern, stories carried by travellers and merchants and that old drunk sailor with 3 fingers and a pet goose. Stories of ports waking back up, of traders in Genoa and Venice hauling cloth and saffron, glass and salt, all the way to Egypt, Constantinople, India. Even, allegedly, a place where people drink cold tea out of golden cups and use monkeys to pick coconuts. Now, is any of it true? Probably not. But it feels true. That's the thing. The world is bigger than it was before the plague. Or maybe it always was, and you're just now starting to notice. Historical fact. In the wake of the Black Death, major trade routes that had collapsed during the pandemic slowly reopened. Italian city-states like Venice, Florence and Genoa re-established contact with Eastern Mediterranean ports. Demand for luxury goods, silks, spices, incense, dyes, surged, especially among the newly wealthy middle class. This expanding curiosity and commerce laid some of the groundwork for what would later become the Age of Exploration. You talk with Adelard one afternoon. Yes, he's back again, this time with a wagon full of soap and Turkish figs. He lets you try one. It's chewy and sweet, and tastes vaguely like old honey with a hint of mystery. You ever been to where this comes from, you ask? He grins. Not yet. But I know someone who has. That someone apparently is a man named Rafal, a Pole who once rode a caravan through the Levant and lived to tell about it. Or at least claimed he did. You meet him 2 days later at the riverside, where he's trading small copper charms for rabbit skins. He's missing one ear and smells like smoked fish. But the man can tell a story. He speaks of Cairo's twisting markets, where spices choke the air and coins never stop clinking, of desert caravans stretching longer than rivers, of cats in silk collars, of candles shaped like dragons, of a giant golden Buddha whose toes are taller than a man. Davy listens with his mouth open. You try to act unimpressed, but you fail. Hard. Because the truth is, for the first time in your life, it feels like you could go. Not just dream, not just hear stories, but actually go. No law to ask permission, no manor to be tied to, no contracts, no chains. People are moving again. Quirky fringe fact. After the plague, some people became long-distance traders, not out of ambition, but survival. With family lines broken and property lost, they turned to the road. Some travelled as merchants, others as pilgrims, mercenaries or wandering craftsmen. There are even accounts of former monks becoming spice traders because their entire monastery died and they had nowhere else to go. Medieval life hack, pivot into global commerce. But it's not all figs and freedom. Travel is still dangerous. Roads are bandit territory. Seas are worse. Storms, pirates, sickness. And then there's the fact that no map is really reliable. You once saw a drawing of the world that had a dragon sitting in Ireland and a man with 3 heads sunbathing in Africa. Still, there's a pull. You find yourself staring at the horizon more than usual. Not the field, not the market, but beyond. Imagining the world as something you could move through, not just toil on. One night, around the fire, you ask Davy, "Would you ever want to see another country?" He nods instantly. "I want to see the ocean." You blink. "You've never seen it?" "Nope. But I heard it tastes like salt." You laugh. It does. And then you realise he's never been more than 3 days' walk from this cottage. He doesn't know the ocean's size, its sound, its violence, its promise. Maybe it's time he does. Open scholarly debate. Did the aftermath of the Black Death cause Europe's expansionist mindset, or did it just happen to coincide with it? Some historians argue that the death toll disrupted local economies so profoundly that people had to look outward, toward trade, colonization and new markets. Others say the plague only accelerated existing trends. But few deny that it reshaped how people imagine distance, travel, and global possibility. You don't decide anything just yet, but you start asking more questions. What ports are closest? How do you hire a spot on a ship? What's the going rate for saffron in Marseille? You start sketching tiny maps in the margins of old parchment, drawing arrows from one town to the next. You're not a noble, you're not a scholar, you're not rich, but you are alive, and alive people can move. You go to bed that night with the window open. The breeze smells like thyme and the goats, but you pretend it smells like sea air. You close your eyes and imagine it, standing on a deck, salt spray in your face, the stars above, and nothing but open water ahead. It's a ridiculous dream, but for once it doesn't feel impossible. You're holding a book, an actual book, handmade, bound in cracked leather, pages thick and yellowed, inked with tight, uneven letters. It smells like dust and candle smoke and something older than memory. You found it in a crate behind the church, half buried under a pile of broken pews and forgotten hymnals. You don't recognise the script at first. It's Latin, maybe, or French, or both. You're not sure. Because here's the honest truth. You can't read. Not really. You can manage a few signs, some numbers, the occasional carved name. But this is another world. You turn the pages slowly, reverently, like they might crumble if you breathe too hard. And for the first time in your life you want to read. Desperately. Because after everything the world's been through, the plague, the silence, the rebuilding, you've started to wonder what else might be waiting in those inked-up pages people keep hoarding in their churches and castles. You're not alone either. People are starting to get curious. Historical fact. The aftermath of the Black Death saw a slow but meaningful increase in literacy and access to education in certain parts of Europe. Monasteries, schools, and clerical institutions had lost enormous numbers of scribes and scholars. In some areas, they began opening their doors to new kinds of students. Urban children, merchant sons, even the occasional ambitious peasant. It wasn't universal, and it wasn't fast, but the wall had cracked. You carry the book to the small schoolhouse in town. It was closed for years after the plague, but lately a few children have been going again, taught by an elderly nun with one eye and a deep hatred of idle hands. You ask if she'll teach you. She laughs. Then she squints. "You're serious?" You nod. She stares at you a long moment. "Fine." But you sweep the floors and chop the firewood. Done. And just like that, you're a student, at 30-something years old. The lessons are slow, painful. You fumble letters like you're trying to juggle eels. You forget how to draw a B and invent your own version of G. But something clicks, eventually. One word, then two, then a sentence that almost makes sense. Davy watches from the back of the room, arms crossed. You can tell he's itching to try it too, but pretending he's too cool. You leave a book open on the table at home, just in case. He starts asking what the letters sound like. Casual, of course. You play along. Quirky fringe fact. In some regions, wealthy families started hiring private tutors for their children because the traditional school structures had collapsed. One result of this? A few lucky students got unusually good educations, and in rare cases so did the servants who overheard the lessons. There are records of cooks, grooms, and even stable boys becoming literate by accident, which is honestly kind of iconic. Back at the schoolhouse, Sister Margot is teaching the children how to read prayers. You're in the corner trying to sound out words from a book of folk tales, some about foxes that trick farmers, others about saints who cry real tears. One story's about a woman who learns to write her own name and then writes a spell to keep her baby from dying. You reread that one twice, and you realise something. Learning to read is more than just a skill, it's a kind of rebellion, because all your life, knowledge was something they had. Lords, clergy, merchants. They wrote the laws, they kept the records, they owned the stories. You worked, you prayed, you obeyed. But now you're reading their words, understanding their systems, learning to name things in a way that isn't just superstition and tradition. Open scholarly debate. Did literacy actually increase meaningfully for peasants and lower-class workers after the plague? Or is that a modern romanticisation? Some scholars argue that only the middle class really benefited, with merchant families investing in education to expand their influence. Others counter that the destabilised post-plague world did make room for scattered exceptions, villages where education trickled down because institutions had no choice but to adapt. Whatever the truth, you know your world is changing. You hear about a young woman in the next village who writes letters for money. People dictate messages to her, requests, confessions, proposals, and she copies them in perfect script, then delivers them by hand or pigeon. She makes more in a week than most farmers earn in a month. You start practicing writing your own name. It's clumsy, uneven, a little embarrassing, but it's yours. And when Davy sees it, he grins like it's a secret code. Can I try? You hand him the charcoal. His first attempt is illegible. His second looks like a squirrel had a seizure. But the third, you can see it. The shape of his name, wobbly, beautiful. You pin it to the wall. Later, sitting by the fire, you look at that page and think about all the books you've never read. All the names that were never written. All the voices that were never heard. Maybe this isn't just about reading. Maybe it's about being seen. Maybe when the world fell apart, it cracked open just enough space for people like you to step in. Not just to till the fields or clean the stables, but to learn, to remember, to write it down. And when the next great wave comes, whether it's plague or fire or war, maybe someone like Davy will have the words to tell the story. Maybe it won't be written about you this time. Maybe it'll be written by you. You're standing in a church, not praying, not confessing, not even lighting a candle. You're at a wedding, sort of. To your left, a woman you've never met is holding a garland of rosemary and whispering what might be vows, or possibly a recipe for beer. To your right, a man in boots too nice for his station is trying very hard not to sneeze. Between them stands a hedge priest, barefoot, drunk, and reciting lines from memory because he lost his prayer book 3 towns ago. You'd laugh, but honestly, it's the 5th wedding like this you've seen in the past year. Something's changed. You just can't decide whether it's beautiful or bonkers. Probably both. Before the plague, marriages were official, slow, and tangled in paperwork, especially for peasants. You had to get approval from your lord if you were a serf. You needed the church to bless it, witnesses to prove it, and sometimes money for the privilege of calling someone wife or husband. Courtship took time, customs took precedence, dowries were negotiated like battle treaties. Now, it's a little more chaotic. People are getting together faster, pairing up across class lines, moving in with someone before the ink dries on whatever rough scroll someone scrawled a contract on, if there's a scroll at all. And in a world where entire families vanished and communities have been stitched back together with strangers and survivors, that makes a strange sort of sense. Historical fact. After the Black Death, marriage patterns across Europe shifted dramatically. There were fewer people, which meant fewer options for traditional matches, especially among the nobility, who preferred to marry within their class. Among peasants and townsfolk, people remarried quickly, and sometimes outside previous social boundaries. Church authorities tried to maintain control, But informal marriages surged. The concept of hand fasting, a promise or trial marriage, also saw a revival. You've seen it all. A woman marrying her late sister's husband to keep the farm going. A boy of 16 marrying a widow with 2 children because he had a good back and she had a roof. Even a noblewoman quietly attaching herself to a dead steward's son. Scandalous, yes, but also the only way to avoid her estate falling into her cousin's greedy lap. You pass a couple in the field one morning. You've seen them walking together for months, whispering, planting side by side, laughing like no one's watching. They used to pretend they weren't living together. Now they hold hands openly. He calls her my heart like it's her actual name. Nobody blinks anymore. Marriage isn't a ceremony now, it's a decision, a declaration, a survival pact, a shoulder to sleep on when your dreams turn to ash again. And honestly, it feels more honest than the old way. Quirky fringe fact. In some places, especially rural parts of England and Scotland, people began practicing marriage by consent, essentially saying, "I take you as my spouse," in front of witnesses, without a priest. The church didn't love this, but with clergy in short supply and parishes hollowed out by plague, enforcement was spotty. In fact, one bishop famously declared that a couple who calls themselves married in a field may be married indeed so long as no cow interrupts them. You go home and find Davy drawing on a slate. He's made little stick figures holding hands, standing in front of what might be a goat or a horse. You squint. "Who's that?" He shrugs. "People in love." You raise an eyebrow. "Since when do you care about love?" He doesn't answer, just grins. That night you think about your own heart. There was someone once, before all this. A girl with soft eyes and a laugh that made you forget how tired your hands were. You just started talking, just started carving little wooden things for her. Buttons, tokens, a comb. And then she was gone. No ceremony, no closure, just gone. You never spoke of her again. Not even to Davy. But lately you've caught yourself wondering if she'd lived, if things had gone differently. If you'd ever have knelt in a church and said the right words while holding her hands, sweaty and shaking. Maybe. Or maybe you'd have just stood in a field, called her your own, and started planting a garden together. Either way would have counted now. Open scholarly debate. Did the Black Death cause the long-term loosening of marriage norms, or were these changes temporary responses to demographic collapse? Some historians argue that the church eventually reasserted control and re-standardized marriage, especially as populations recovered in the 15th century. Others believe the cracks in tradition left permanent marks, creating room for more informal unions and reshaping gender roles in the domestic sphere. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. You start noticing something new in your village. Not just the couples, but the way people care for each other. Uncles raising nieces, neighbours nursing each other through sickness, friends choosing to share homes, not because of romance, but because of trust. People are choosing their families now, you see it every day. The next time there's a wedding, you bring bread. You sit in the second row, eat too much honey cake, and watch 2 people who've lost half their worlds make something new out of what's left. No crown, no choir, just hands clasped, eyes shining, and a vow whispered into wind. You think, this is enough. And for the first time in a long while, it really is. You smell it before you hear it. Smoke. Not cooking fire, not hearth fire. Thick, acidic, scorched earth smoke. The kind that clings to your clothes and won't wash out for days. You rise from your stool in the garden and look toward the horizon. The village to the north is burning. Again, you don't panic, yet. But your stomach tightens, your feet already moving before your thoughts catch up. Davy spots the smoke too. He grabs the water buckets without being told. You both know what this means. The plague is back. Historical fact. The Black Death didn't end in 1351. It came back again and again in waves. Smaller, yes, but still deadly. The second major outbreak hit in 1361 to 62, especially devastating to children and young adults. Other outbreaks followed every 10 to 15 years. It didn't fully disappear from Europe until the 18th century. For many people, it was just life now, a lurking shadow. By the time you reach the crossroads, the whispers have already started. They say it came on a ship, foreign sailors, coughing up blood. No, it was the rats again. The black ones with glassy eyes. No, it's God. We built that new tavern and forgot to bless it. You don't say anything. You just watch the smoke and wait. And then, like clockwork, the carts appear. Wooden, creaking, covered in cloth. Families moving again, fleeing again, wide-eyed children, women clutching crucifixes, men carrying bundles wrapped in haste. They avoid eye contact. You step aside to let them pass. A little girl sneezes and the whole line flinches like a bowstring snapping. It's back. You can't see it yet, but you know. The town downriver has closed its gates. You hear they nailed the door shut from the inside, left a sign painted in tar. No entry, no mercy. Another village turned away a merchant caravan and burned their own bridge to stop the crossing. You're told some were trapped on the wrong side. You're told they begged. You're told no one answered. The air thickens, and with it, the fear. Quirky fringe fact. In Milan, during the early plagues, officials walled up entire houses with the sick still inside to stop the spread. It was brutal and effective. Milan had lower death rates than surrounding cities, but well, you can imagine the public relations nightmare. Still, for centuries afterward, Milan was held up as the gold standard of plague containment, which again involved walling up your neighbours. You and Davy sit at the edge of the field that night, staring at the horizon, both pretending not to be afraid. He finally speaks. Do you think we'll die this time? You want to say no. Instead you say, not if we're careful. He nods. It's not enough, but it's something. You start boiling water. You hang bundles of dried herbs in the windows. You pull out that old pouch of lavender the plague doctor gave you years ago. It still smells faintly sweet. You tell yourself it's protection, even if it's only memory. Then you start hearing the music. Not joyful music. The other kind. There's a man who walks through town banging a drum and chanting, "Have mercy, have mercy, have mercy." A group of people kneel in the street, whipping their backs, blood mixing with the dirt. The flagellants are back, more organised this time, uniformed, focused. Their leader wears a silver mask and speaks in rhyming couplets. It's deeply unsettling. They say the plague is punishment for not punishing the first time. They say it's back because people started dancing again, laughing again, getting comfortable. You watch as a small crowd follows them out of town, whipped into fever. You do not follow. Open scholarly debate. Did the return of the plague in cycles cause a sense of learned helplessness or hardened resilience? Some historians believe the repeated waves traumatized whole generations, plague babies growing up into plague parents, with a worldview shaped by instability and dread. Others argue it created a strange form of endurance. People adapted, prepared, even joked. A kind of emotional callus over centuries of repeated shock. You feel both, terrified, and weirdly, ready. You plant garlic along the edge of your garden. A superstition, sure, but also practical. Keeps the goats from eating your beans. You patch the roof again. You stock dried meat, bitter herbs, and vinegar-soaked rags. You teach Davy how to pack quickly. You start checking his temperature every morning just in case. He rolls his eyes, but he doesn't stop you. Then one night it hits your village. Not a fire, not a panic, a cough from the butcher's house. You hear it as you walk past, a deep, rattling cough that makes your blood run cold. By dawn, the house is shuttered. By dusk, a red cross is painted on the door. No one speaks it aloud, but you all know the old rule that God have mercy on this house. You go home and close your shutters. This is not the first time, and it may not be the last. But something inside you has changed. The first time the plague came, the world collapsed. Now, you know how to bend with it. You're not the same scared farmhand you once were. You're not waiting for someone else to save you. You've got dried herbs, vinegar rags, and a plan. You've got people who depend on you. And you've got the quiet, stubborn knowledge that yes, death comes, but so do sunrises. So you light a candle, and you wait. You're walking through the village square and hear it. Soft at first, almost too quiet to notice. A whistle, a few plucked strings. Then someone starts to sing. You freeze. Not because it's shocking to hear music, you've heard it all your life, but because of what they're singing. It's a song about death. More specifically, it's about a skeleton who visits a wedding, steals the bride and dances her off into the woods, laughing the whole time. Everyone's clapping along like it's the funniest thing they've ever heard. And it kind of is. You join the edge of the gathering crowd. A man with a fiddle and a shock of white hair is stomping one boot in rhythm while his companion, an older woman with a voice like wind through dry grass, sings the next verse. She danced on graves, she danced on bones, with teeth like pearls and hips of stone. Come marry me, she said with cheer. Your vows won't last, but never fear. People are howling. You see a farmer's wife wiping tears of laughter from her cheeks. A child reenacts the skeleton dance with disturbing precision. Even the reeve is grinning. You lean against a post and listen. Because this is something new, or maybe something old returning with new shape. Historical fact. After the plague, folk music took a strange and fascinating turn across Europe. Themes of death, decay, and absurdity surged in popularity. Songs like Totentanz in Germany or macabre ballads in England turned grim subjects into catchy refrains. It wasn't just escapism, it was a way for people to wrestle with what they'd lived through, to stare the Reaper in the face and laugh. You've heard these songs on the road too, ballads of skeletons falling in love, odes to gravediggers with hearts of gold, a lullaby sung by a plague widow that ends with the line, "Sleep, sweet child, and don't you cry, your brother's bones are almost dry." And somehow they don't feel cruel. They feel honest, like everyone's finally dropped the act. Davy starts singing them too, badly. You catch him humming a tune about death losing a game of dice to a miller's apprentice. His version changes every time. Somehow, Death ends up washing dishes in one version, and in another, he falls in love with a cow. You don't correct him. Quirky fringe fact. There's an actual plague songbook, compiled sometime in the 1370s by a wandering scribe in what's now northern France. It includes over 40 verses of death-themed drinking songs, advice to the recently widowed, and a surprising number of jokes about monks hiding under beds during outbreaks. One line reads, "If you smell roses and hear no birds, check the floor." You might be next a real toe tapper, but it's not just music. You start hearing laughter in places where it used to be silent. Wakes are rowdy now, half funeral, half roast. Someone brings ale, someone else plays a flute, and the whole room tells stories about the deceased's worst habits. He used to snore like a goat drowning in soup. She once slapped a bishop for sneezing too close. Remember the time he tried to outdrink a monk and ended up in the duck pond? It's all love, masked in mischief, and it's healing something. Open scholarly debate. Is this surge in grim humour after the Black Death a sign of psychological trauma or social resilience? Some historians believe the macabre comedy was a defence mechanism, gallows humour protecting people from unbearable grief. Others see it as a cultural transformation. Death was no longer distant and sanitised. It had moved in. People adapted their rituals, their language, their jokes to live beside it. One night you sit by the fire carving another little wooden figure, this one of a skeleton holding a wine jug. Davy asks what you're making. Death, you say. He frowns. He looks happy. You shrug. He's had a long week. You add a goat sitting beside him, hooves up, also holding a mug. Davy nods solemnly. That's fair. You think about how different the mood was the first time the plague hit. Silence, fear, mourning without end. But now, people grieve differently. They still cry, still shake, still whisper the names of the lost like prayers. But they also tell jokes. They write songs. They dance with ghosts like they're old friends. Because when death won't leave, you might as well give it a seat at the table and pour it a drink. Later that week, you attend a burial. A woman who lived a long life, relatively speaking, dies in her sleep, wrapped in wool and rosemary. The whole village comes. The priest says the usual words. Then her brother steps forward and starts singing a version of the skeleton wedding song. She wore white bones and a veil of stars, with worms that waltz down ancient scars. And by the third verse, the whole crowd joins in. No one sobs, but everyone's crying in their own way. You realise standing there that this is what healing looks like. Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't happen, but laughing anyway, singing anyway, living anyway. The tune stays in your head all the way home. You whistle it as you check the goats. Davy adds new verses under his breath. You don't know when the plague will return, but if it does, you'll meet it with garlic at the windows, vinegar-soaked cloths, and a song on your tongue about how death once slipped on a turnip and broke his hip. Because sometimes the only way to survive grief is to laugh loud enough that it gets confused and leaves you alone. You're fixing a fence when you hear the bells. Not the sweet, distant kind, the ones that float through the air on feast days or weddings. Number. These are heavy, urgent. They hammer the wind. They mean someone important is dead. You look up. The manor house on the hill, what's left of it, has smoke curling from the chimney. The old flag is hanging limp. A rider passes you at a gallop, cloak streaming, horse foaming at the mouth. The lord is dead, and you're not sure anyone cares. That's not the reaction people used to have. Before the plague, a noble's death was a big deal. There'd be mourning periods, black banners, ceremonial processions with slow-walking oxen, and priests mumbling Latin while the peasants stood at attention like terrified trees. Because when a noble died, the whole world shook. Now, it just shifts slightly and keeps going, and you realise that something has changed, not just in your village, but everywhere. The power structure is wobbly, and it's been wobbling for a while. Historical fact. The Black Death wiped out a huge number of nobles across Europe, especially during the first and second waves. Entire bloodlines vanished. In England alone, some estimates suggest that a third of the nobility died. This sudden vacuum of power destabilised feudal hierarchies and led to complicated inheritance crises, power grabs, and in many cases, nobody stepping up at all. In your case, the dead lord's son hasn't been seen in years. Some say he ran off to sea. Others whisper he joined a monastery. One woman swears she saw him performing in a travelling play, dressed like a goat. Either way, the manor's empty now, and nobody's waiting for orders. You and your neighbours meet in the square that night. Not officially, just people drifting toward each other like iron filings to a magnet. "What happens now?" someone asks. A silence follows. Then a carpenter shrugs. "I say we finish the harvest. The grain won't wait. So you do. No one tells you to. No one grants permission. You just organise yourselves, assign plots, set days, trade tools. Someone starts keeping track of work on a slate. Someone else volunteers to handle disputes. A blacksmith offers to fix everyone's ploughs in exchange for 3 loaves of bread and some ale. It's cooperative, not perfect, but functional, and there's something radical about that. Nobody's in charge, and yet, somehow, everything still gets done. Quirky fringe fact. In parts of Italy and France, some villages became quasi-independent communes after the plague, especially where noble families had died out or fled. They elected councils, managed taxes locally, and even hired their own guards. Some of these towns thrived, others collapsed in chaos. But for a few brief decades, the dream of local rule wasn't just a dream, it was real. You pass the manor house on your way to market one morning. The gates are open, vines creep over the windows, the stables are empty except for one wild-eyed rooster who's clearly claimed dominion. You could walk right in and sit at the Lord's table. Some already have. Someone even moved the long bench into the chapel to use during Sunday meals. Nobody asked, nobody objected. Because the symbols don't mean what they used to. The titles, the seals, the old family banners, they don't carry the weight anymore. The people who once upheld them are gone, and the people still here, they've learned to live without them. Open scholarly debate. Was the decline of noble influence after the plague a sign of early democracy, or simply a temporary decentralisation of power? Some historians argue that local self-governance and labour organisation planted the seeds of future political movements. Others caution that much of this autonomy was eventually crushed, either by surviving nobles, rising monarchies, or the church. But for a time, the social script was rewritten. You think about that while watching 2 boys race down the road on donkeys, laughing like madmen. No lord would have tolerated that before. Now, nobody stops them. And honestly, why should they? You see new kinds of leaders forming, not through blood, but through trust. People who get things done. The woman who keeps track of planting schedules. The man who organises the shared oxen. The widow who makes the best decisions in disputes and can shame a thief into repentance with one look. Nobody calls them Your Grace, but everyone listens. And the people with the old names, they're fading. You hear a rumour that a surviving noble from a nearby county rode into a village last week, tried to demand grain as his right. The villagers told him he could take the grain, but he'd have to work the field first. He left in a huff. His horse stepped in a molehill and threw him. The grain stayed put. There's a joke now. Goes like this. Q. What do you call a noble without land or title? A. A man with good boots and a very confused face. You tell it at the next gathering. People laugh harder than they should, and when the autumn rains come and you all gather to plan the winter stores, someone raises a cup and toasts. To the Lord. Everyone groans. He grins. No, not the dead one. US, the new lords. It's ridiculous. And somehow true. Because here you are, not waiting for permission, not fearing a name, not kneeling when the wind changes. You're not a rebel, you're not a revolutionary, you're just governing yourself. And in a world that used to insist you were nothing, that might be the most powerful thing of all. You wake up to a knock at the door, not the desperate kind, not the trembling late night, their sickness kind. This one's polite, almost cheerful. You open it to find a man in a blue tunic holding a basket and a scroll. "Message for the house," he says, and hands it to you like you've always been the kind of person who gets messages. Inside the basket, 2 apples, a small cloth pouch of salt, and a tiny carved token, a goat, surprisingly well made. Inside the scroll, a list of names. Yours is one of them. You stare at it, confused. "It's for the council," the man explains. "You've been nominated." "Council?" He grins. "Yeah, we're having one now." And just like that, you've been drafted into politics. Sort of. Historical fact. In many towns and rural communities after the Black Death, informal councils or local assemblies began to take over some of the functions once handled by absentee lords or weakened clergy. These bodies varied wildly. Some were democratic, others dominated by rich families or guild leaders, but all reflected a growing sense of local autonomy and self-regulation in the post-plague world. You walk to the meeting house, formerly the old ale barn, now freshly swept, with Davy trailing behind you, asking a million questions. Are you going to be in charge? No. Will you get a crown? Definitely not. Will there be food? Probably. It's still us, after all. When you arrive, the place is buzzing. Not with formality. There are no robes, no fancy chairs, no scrolls of law. Just people. Farmers, weavers, bakers, brewers. The butcher's wife is taking notes with a piece of charcoal on a flat board. The blacksmith is already arguing with the beekeeper about who gets to use the communal cart on market days, and nobody's shouting, at least not angrily. It's all functional chaos, the way a kitchen gets wild before the stew is ready. You're given a stool, a mug of cider, and a voice, which is strange, because not that long ago your opinion wouldn't have mattered. You would have been standing outside this building, waiting to hear what had already been decided. Now they ask what you think about a shared tool shed, whether the road to the river should be repaired, whether the travelling herbalist should be offered winter lodging, and you answer, carefully at first, then with more confidence, because they listen, not all the time, and not without debate, but when you speak, people nod. You're part of it, and it's weirdly addicting. Quirky fringe fact. In certain areas of Switzerland and southern Germany, post-plague communities developed intricate systems of village law, where councils of farmers or artisans made collective decisions. These early democratic experiments included rotating leadership, shared resource management, and communal punishment systems that involved shame rituals, like making someone clean latrines or wear a chicken feather hat for a week. Delightful. The meetings become regular, once a month at first, then every 2 weeks. Tasks are assigned, disputes are aired. A teenager proposes a library. Everyone laughs, then realizes it's not a bad idea. Someone brings a map and points out where new trees should be planted to prevent floods. A new family is welcomed with warm bread and cautious questions. You find yourself looking forward to the gatherings, not because you crave power, but because the work is yours, the choices are yours, and the solutions, flawed and slow as they are, come from you. You've never felt more grounded, more equal. Open scholarly debate. Was the rise of a local governance after the Black Death a meaningful step toward modern democracy, or just a temporary survival mechanism? Some argue it revealed a latent capacity for collective organisation that had been suppressed by feudalism. Others say these councils were isolated and unstable, eventually overwritten by centralised monarchies. Still, the fact that peasants and townsfolk did govern themselves sometimes effectively challenges centuries of narrative about passive rural populations. You start keeping a record, just a small one, a roll of parchment tucked into a jar to stay dry. What was discussed? Who said what? Which proposals passed? It's not required, but it feels important. Davy draws tiny pictures in the margins, stick figure versions of villagers, a goat wearing glasses, and what you assume is you, holding a gavel. You are not holding a gavel. At the next meeting, the brewer suggests a winter festival. Why? Someone asks. Because we've all survived, he says. Again. And the room goes quiet. Then someone says, we'll need music. Then someone else offers, I can roast chestnuts. And just like that, it becomes official. You help plan it, hang garlands, build bonfires, approve budgets for ale and meat pies. It's chaotic, joyful, completely disorganized, and it's one of the best nights of your life. People dance, sing, joke. Someone makes a skeleton puppet and reenacts death slipping on turnips again. Davy ends up falling asleep under a bench, face covered in crumbs, and you sit there, warm cider in your hands, watching it all and thinking, we built this. Not just the festival, not just the meeting houses, but this life. Open, unowned, shared, imperfect, real. You walk home that night with tired feet and a lighter heart. No one rules you now, not really. You've got something better, responsibility, which, as it turns out, feels a lot like freedom. You're standing in the field again, just as the frost lets go of the earth. There's a breeze, sharp and clean. You close your eyes and breathe it in. Damp soil, sheep wool, the faintest trace of rosemary still clinging to the windowsill from last season. The goats are yelling about something ridiculous in the distance. Davy is trying to convince them that yes, they really do need to wear flower garlands for today. Because today is different. It's been years since the Black Death first came, and somehow you're still here. You didn't plan to make a big deal out of it. But word got around, someone mentioned it was the anniversary, someone else started baking, then a cart showed up with cider, and suddenly half the village was building a bonfire and arguing over who gets to sing first. So now, here you are, in your best, least stained tunic, hair combed, standing on a small rise of land with the rest of them, looking around and thinking, this isn't what life used to be, but maybe it's what life's supposed to be. Historical fact. In the decades after the Black Death, Europe began to slowly settle into what scholars call a new normal. Entire systems had shifted. Labour, land ownership, social roles, and personal freedoms. Though it would take centuries for some of the biggest changes to fully materialise, the plague cracked the old world open, and from that fracture came something else. Possibility. You look around. The people who used to walk behind carts, heads low, voices soft, now they walk upright. They speak with opinions. They disagree. They ask questions. They laugh while holding spades and scythes. That used to be unthinkable. And the land? It's different too. Fields are fuller. Crops are stranger. Someone planted pumpkins this year and insist they're magic. There are terraces where woods used to be, and someone built a fish pond out of an old well. You heard a girl talking about irrigation, and she wasn't even a noble's daughter. You sit beside her at meetings now. Quirky fringe fact. There are accounts, half fact, half legend, of post-plague villages founding their own schools, led by former monks, nuns, or just whoever could read best. In one town, a retired soldier taught arithmetic using bones and wine cups. In another, lessons were taught through songs and woodcuts passed from house to house like gossip. Learning became patchwork, but it spread. You've learned too, you can read now. Not everything, but enough. You've read old tales and new ideas. You even copied one of those macabre songs into your own rough book, right under Davy's sketch of a plague doctor with a goat mask. He's working on his letters. You help when he asks. You don't push. The idea is that he chooses. Choice. That's something new. Because this life used to be carved out for you before you were born. You would live and work and die on a patch of land you never owned, in service to people whose names were stitched in gold. But those names are gone now, or at least quieter. And the patch of land, it feels like yours. Even if no one gave you a deed or a scroll with wax seals, you planted it, you tended it, you fed people with it. That counts for something. Open scholarly debate. Did the social shifts after the Black Death permanently alter class dynamics in Europe, or did the elite reassert control over time? The answer is both. In many areas, peasants won rights they'd never had. Wages, mobility, freedom to marry or leave land. In others, laws were passed to clamp down and force people back into pre-plague roles. But the idea that the world could change had taken root, and that was irreversible. You see it in how people speak now, not just in council meetings, but around the fire, in jokes, in passing. They talk like their opinions matter, like they're part of the story. You think about your younger self sometimes, the one who stood in line waiting for a priest's blessing to not die, the one who didn't ask questions, the one who watched neighbours disappear and didn't know whether to grieve or just move out of the way. That person is gone. What's left is someone who plants garlic in careful rows and sings plague songs while sharpening a hoe. Someone who teaches a child how to write his name and how to carve a skeleton with goofy teeth, and how to mix vinegar and thyme because it might help, or it might just smell better when things get bad again. Because yes, it might come back. The death, the sickness, the grief, it probably will. But you'll face it differently this time, not with silence, but with songs, with bread, with stories, with your sleeves rolled up and a plan scratched on the wall beside your fire. And if the world crumbles again, you'll build it again, with neighbours, with laughter, with your bare, calloused hands. Tonight, as the fire crackles and the cider flows, you listen to a new song someone wrote just for this day. It's not about death, not exactly. It's about living in spite of it. Davy joins in the chorus. You do too. And when it's over, you raise your mug and toast. To the ones who didn't make it. To the ones who did. To the ones we're still becoming. Because after all the plague took, what it couldn't take was this. The will to begin again. The fire burns low now. Just glowing embers, snapping softly, casting long shadows across the earth. Davy is asleep beside the hearth, curled up with one arm over his face, the little carved goat tucked under his arm like it might protect him from whatever dreams sneak in. You sit for a moment longer, not doing anything in particular, just sitting, listening, feeling the stillness of a world that somehow kept going. You think of the people you've lost, the ones whose names you never got to write down, the faces that blurred with time, the memories that come back strongest at dusk. But you also think of what's been built, of laughter on winter nights, of fields planted with strange new crops, of children learning to write their own names, even if they draw dragons in the margins, of meetings in old barns and jokes at wakes, and festivals held not because life is perfect, but because it continues. And it's easy in that moment to believe this truth. You survived something terrible. But survival wasn't the end of the story. It was the start. So now, as the coals hum low and your body softens into sleep, you let yourself rest. You've earned it. Not just for what you lived through, but for what you dared to rebuild after. Because in the end, life after the Black Death wasn't just harder, or stranger, or sadder. It was yours, built with your hands, shaped by your choices, lit by the same fire that refuses to go out. So sleep easy tonight. The world will still be there tomorrow, and so will you.